My name is Clara Mitchell. I am 31 years old, working as a medical billing specialist at a hospital in suburban Ohio. Last week, while my parents and older sister were clinking champagne glasses on a luxury yacht, I stood completely alone in the freezing, pouring rain by my grandfather's grave. I was shivering, clutching the funeral invoices I had just drained my entire life savings to pay. Exactly 3 days later, at the attorney's office, my parents strutted in with arrogant smiles, absolutely certain they were about to inherit a multi-million-dollar commercial property. But when the attorney broke the seal on my grandfather's final handwritten note, those greedy smiles vanished instantly. My grandfather had written, "I knew you would not attend my funeral." And that was just the beginning of the most devastating sentence they would ever face. Before I tell you how I legally and completely stripped them of everything they owned, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly believe that people reap exactly what they sow. Also, drop a comment telling me what state or a country you are watching from right now and what time it is there. I love reading where my stories reach. Now let us go back to the exact moment everything began to shatter. It was a Tuesday evening in late September, and I was standing at the pharmacy counter holding my breath as the card reader beeped. Insufficient funds. The bright red letters flashed on the terminal screen, mocking me. The pharmacist, a kind woman who had seen me every week for the past 4 months, gave me a deeply sympathetic look. "I am so sorry, Clara," she said gently. "The total for Henry's heart medication and the new oxygen supplies comes out to $840. Do you have another credit card?" I swallowed the heavy lump forming in my throat and shook my head. I pulled out my phone, pretending to check my banking app, but I already knew the exact numbers. My checking account had $12 left. My emergency savings were completely gone. I had spent the last 4 months working 10-hour shifts at the hospital, analyzing medical bills for strangers all day, only to spend every cent of my own paycheck keeping my grandfather alive. My grandfather Henry was 78 years old. He had run a local hardware store for 40 years, building a modest but comfortable life through honest hard work. When he was diagnosed with terminal heart failure earlier that year, my family reacted not with grief, but with extreme inconvenience. My parents, Richard and Susan, had spent the last decade obsessed with clawing their way to the top of our local country club hierarchy. They drove leased luxury cars they could barely afford and hosted lavish dinner parties to impress people who did not actually care about them. And then there was my older sister, Ashley. Ashley was 33, the undisputed golden child of the Mitchell family. She was married to Greg, a loud, boastful commercial real estate developer who wore too much cologne and constantly bragged about his golf handicap. When grandfather got sick, my parents and Ashley held a brief family meeting that felt much more like a cold corporate strategy session. Richard cleared his throat and announced that they were in a crucial networking phase for Greg's new business ventures. They simply did not have the time to sit by a sickbed. They unilaterally decided that since I was single and worked in healthcare, I was the logical choice to handle 100% of his daily care. I agreed to help because I loved my grandfather. He was the only person in the Mitchell household who had ever looked at me and seen someone valuable, but I had no idea that their version of stepping back meant complete and total abandonment. They stopped visiting, they stopped calling, and most importantly, they completely stopped contributing to his care. I stood at the pharmacy counter feeling the weight of the past 4 months crushing my shoulders. I stepped aside to let the next customer pay and walked out to the parking lot. The cold Ohio wind bit through my thin hospital scrubs. I sat in my 10-year-old sedan, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had to call my mother. I hated asking her for anything because in our family, asking for help was always treated as a personal failure, unless, of course, the person asking was Ashley. Before making the call, I drove to grandfather's house to check his vitals and prepare his dinner. His home was a small brick ranch house that always smelled like pine wood and old books. When I walked into his bedroom, he was propped up against the pillows. His body was failing. The congestive heart failure had made his breathing shallow and his skin pale, but his mind was as sharp as a razor. He watched me walk in, setting down the meager bags of groceries I had managed to buy with my last bit of cash. He looked at my face and he knew instantly. Clara, he said, his voice raspy but steady. You look exhausted, child. I forced a bright smile, pasting on the same cheerful mask I wore for the patients at the hospital. I am fine, Grandpa. Just a long day at the billing department. I will get your dinner ready, and then we can watch that history documentary you like. Henry reached out and rested his frail hand over mine. His grip was weak, but the intense focus in his eyes made me freeze. You cannot keep doing this alone, Clara, he said quietly. Where is Richard? Where is your mother? I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. You know how they are. I lied, smoothing his blanket. Greg has that big real estate deal coming up. They are just swamped with networking events. Henry let out a sound that was half cough, half bitter laugh. Networking, he repeated. That is what they call ignoring a dying man. They think I do not see it, Clara. They think because my body is stuck in this bed, my brain has stopped working. They think they can just wait me out. I sat on the edge of his bed, feeling a sudden rush of tears threatening to spill. Grandpa, please do not talk like that. You just need to rest. He squeezed my hand again. I am resting, child, but I am also watching. I see you coming here every night after working all day. I see the dark circles under your eyes, and I know exactly what my son and his wife are doing. They think they have it all figured out, but they are going to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you treat family like a stepping stone. I did not fully understand what he meant at the time. I just thought it was the frustration of a sick man feeling neglected. I checked his oxygen levels, gave him his evening pills from the dwindling supply, and promised I would be right back. I walked into the hallway, closing his bedroom door gently behind me. I pulled out my phone and stared at my mother's contact name. My chest tightened with anxiety. I pressed dial and held the phone to my ear, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times. She answered on the 4th ring, and the background noise was immediately chaotic. I could hear loud music playing and the muffled voices of women chatting. What is it? Clara Susan asked. Her tone was clipped, irritated that her evening was being interrupted. Hi, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I am at the pharmacy. Well, I was at the pharmacy. Grandfather needs his heart medication refilled, and the oxygen supply company needs their monthly payment. I am completely out of money, Mom. I drained my savings last week to pay his property tax, so he would not lose the house. I just need a few $100s to get his medicine. There was a sharp exhale on the other end of the line. Clara, I really cannot deal with your dramatic exaggerations right now. I am at the boutique downtown. Ashley and I are doing our final dress fittings. We have the big networking party on Mr. Carlson's yacht this Sunday. Greg has been working for months to get us on that guest list. This yacht party could secure a multi-million-dollar contract for him. Do you understand how important this is for your sister's future? I pressed my forehead against the cool plaster of the hallway wall, closing my eyes. Mom, I understand the party is important to you, but Grandfather literally needs this medication to keep his heart pumping. I have not asked you for a single dime in 4 months. I am working 10-hour shifts and coming straight here to clean him, feed him, and bathe him. I have nothing left. Can you please just transfer $400? I could hear the rustle of silk fabric through the phone and my mother giving instructions to a tailor before she spoke back into the receiver. Listen to yourself, Clara, she scoffed. You are always playing the victim. We are building a legacy here. Greg is about to break into the commercial elite and you are bothering me over some pharmacy bill. Just put it on your credit card. My credit cards are maxed out, I pleaded, my voice breaking. I used them to pay his hospital co-pays last month when he was in the emergency room. The emergency room you did not even bother to visit. Do not take that tone with me, young lady, Susan snapped, her voice turning to pure ice. We are doing what is best for the family. We cannot put our entire lives on hold just because you cannot manage your finances properly. If you were better at your job, maybe you would have more savings. You are single with no responsibilities. Taking care of your grandfather is the least you can do to contribute to this family. Now stop being so dramatic. I have to go, the tailor is waiting to pin this hem. Mom, please, I begged. The line went dead. She had hung up on me. I stood in the dimly lit hallway listening to the silence of the house. In the distance, a clock ticked on the living room wall. I looked down at the blank screen of my phone. She was fitting a designer dress for a yacht party, while her own father-in-law lay dying in the next room, and her daughter stood in the hallway begging for medicine money. The sheer staggering cruelty of it washed over me, making my entire body shake. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be the good daughter. I had accepted the hand-me-downs, the cancelled birthday dinners, the constant comparisons to Ashley. I had swallowed every insult and taken on every burden they threw at me, believing that if I just sacrificed enough, they would eventually see my value. But standing there in that hallway with my bank account at zero and my heart shattered into a million pieces, the delusion finally cracked. They were never going to see my value. To them, I was not a daughter. I was free labor. I was a convenient dumping ground for the responsibilities they found too messy or too boring. They wanted the prestige of the country club, the luxury cars and the yacht parties, while leaving me to wipe the sweat from a dying man's forehead. I slowly lowered the phone. The tears that had been threatening to fall dried up instantly, replaced by a cold, hard knot forming in the pit of my stomach. I walked back into grandfather's room. He was watching the doorway, his sharp eyes tracking my every movement. "Did you call her?" he asked. I nodded, walking over to the nightstand to organize his remaining pills. "What did she say?" I paused, looking at the fragile old man who had always treated me with kindness. I could not tell him that his own son's wife cared more about a silk dress than his life. She said she is sorry I lied, smoothly keeping my voice even, but their accounts are tied up in Greg's new real estate investment. "It is fine, Grandpa. I will call the hospital billing department tomorrow and ask for an advance on my paycheck. We will figure it out. We always do." Henry looked at me for a long time. The history documentary murmured softly from the television in the corner. He reached under his pillow, his frail fingers moving with deliberate purpose. He pulled out a small brass key and held it out to me. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Take this." I looked at the key, confused. "What is this for?" "It is for the heavy wooden toolbox in the garage," he instructed, "the one locked under the workbench. I want you to open it tonight after I go to sleep. There is a false bottom inside. Underneath it, you will find a stack of bank statements and legal documents from the past 3 years. I want you to take them to your apartment and hide them. And Clara," I leaned in closer, "do not say a single word to your parents about what you find. Let them keep playing their games. Let them get on that yacht. Their time is coming." I took the brass key, feeling the cold metal press into my palm. I did not know what was in that box, but the fierce determination in my grandfather's eyes told me that the Mitchell family was standing on the edge of a steep cliff, and they had absolutely no idea they were about to fall. My grandfather, Henry, passed away exactly 3 days after he gave me that brass key. It happened in the quietest hours of the morning, right before dawn, when the world is completely still. I was sitting in the armchair beside his bed, holding his hand as his breathing slowed and finally stopped. There was no grand finale, just a gentle release. I sat there in the silence for a long time, listening to the steady hum of the oxygen machine that was no longer needed. A heavy, numb sorrow settled into my chest. I had lost the only person in this family who actually saw me. I made the phone calls as the sun began to rise over the Ohio suburbs. I called my parents' house first. My father answered, his voice groggy and irritated by the early hour. When I told him his father was gone, there was a brief pause on the other end of the line. He did not cry. He did not ask how it happened or if grandfather had been in pain. His first words were a heavy sigh, followed by a complaint about how inconvenient the timing was. "Greg is flying in a major client this week," Richard said, his voice thick with sleep. "We cannot afford any distractions right now. Clara, you are going to have to handle the funeral arrangements. We will be there for the service, but you need to take care of the heavy lifting. Your mother is already stressed enough with the country club gala preparations." Before I could even respond, he hung up. The dial tone echoed in my ear, matching the hollow feeling in my stomach. They were not coming over to say goodbye. They were not coming to comfort me or to mourn the man who had given them everything. They were outsourcing their grief to me the same way they outsourced his care. The next 4 days were a blur of exhausting bureaucratic nightmares. Planning a funeral is a grueling process, but planning one entirely alone while carrying the weight of a family that refuses to show up is a special kind of hell. I sat in the funeral director's office, a room that smelled overwhelmingly of artificial lilies and old polish, looking at a catalog of caskets that I could not afford. The director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Abernathy, gently walked me through the costs. The burial plot, the embalming, the service fees, the headstone. The numbers added up with terrifying speed. When he handed me the final invoice, the total was just over $9,000. I pulled out my phone and called my mother standing in the funeral home lobby. "Mom, I need you to transfer some money," I told her, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "The funeral home requires payment up front. The total is 9,000. I heard Susan let out an exasperated breath. "Clara, I already told you our liquid assets are completely tied up in Greg's new commercial development project. We cannot just pull $9,000 out of thin air. You work in medical billing, you know how to deal with invoices. Just put it on your credit cards and we will reimburse you when the development deal closes next quarter." "Mom, my credit cards are almost maxed out from buying his medication," I pleaded. "Well, open a new one," Susan snapped. "You're 31 years old, Clara. You need to learn how to manage adult situations without bothering us every 5 minutes. We are grieving too in our own way. Now please, I have to go to a fitting." She ended the call. I stood in that lobby gripping my phone until my hand cramped. I walked back into Mr. Abernathy's office and handed him 3 different credit cards, splitting the massive bill across accounts that I knew would take me years to pay off on my modest hospital salary. I drained every last cent I had to my name to bury a man whose own son refused to spare a dime. The day of the burial was bleak. An unseasonable torrential downpour hit Ohio, turning the sky the color of bruised iron and the ground into a slippery, muddy mess. I arrived at the cemetery an hour early, driving my old sedan through the flooded gates. I wore a simple black dress and a thin raincoat that did absolutely nothing to stop the biting chill. When the hearse arrived, I stood by the open grave watching the cemetery workers lower the casket into the muddy earth. I looked around the green canvas tent set up to shield the mourners from the rain. It was entirely empty. There were dozens of folding chairs set out for the Mitchell family, for Richard's business associates, for Susan's country club friends, for Ashley and Greg's elite network. But no one came. The only people standing under that tent were me, the local pastor, and Thomas Davis. Thomas was an older gentleman with a sharp gaze and a quiet demeanor. He had been Grandfather Henry's closest friend and personal attorney for over 30 years. He stood beside me holding a large black umbrella over both of us, his face unreadable. We waited. The pastor checked his watch. The rain hammered against the canvas roof in a deafening roar. Water pooled around our shoes, ruining my cheap black pumps. I kept looking toward the cemetery entrance, expecting to see Greg's luxury SUV pull through the gates. I checked my phone every 2 minutes. Nothing. "We should give them another 10 minutes, I told the pastor, my teeth chattering from the cold. "The weather is awful. I am sure they are just stuck in traffic." Thomas Davis looked at me. His eyes held a mixture of deep pity and profound understanding. "Clara," he said softly, "we should begin the service." I shook my head stubbornly, clinging to the last shred of hope that my family would not actually skip their own father's burial. "No, they promised they would be here. My dad said they would come to the service. We just have to wait." 5 more minutes passed, then 10. The pastor cleared his throat and opened his Bible. Just as he began to read the opening prayer, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, shielding the screen from the rain. It was a text message from my mother. The message read, "Traffic is terrible on the interstate. Greg says we will never make it in time. Just start the service without us. We will honor Henry in our own way today." A cold shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the freezing rain. Traffic on the interstate. It was a Sunday morning in suburban Ohio. Even with the rain, the roads would not be completely deadlocked. Something pulled at my gut, a terrible nagging intuition that I had ignored for far too long. With trembling, wet fingers, I opened the Facebook app on my phone. I tapped on the search bar and typed in Ashley's name. Her profile loaded. Right at the very top of her feed was a new post, uploaded exactly 10 minutes ago. It was a photograph. The sky in the picture was cloudy, but there was no rain. They were not on the interstate. They were standing on the polished teak deck of a massive, multi-million-dollar yacht. My father Richard was wearing a crisp white polo shirt, laughing at something off camera. My mother Susan was holding a crystal martini glass, wearing a designer nautical-themed dress. Ashley and Greg were standing in the center of the frame, their arms wrapped around each other, smiling brightly with the kind of carefree joy reserved for people who do not have a single worry in the world. I stared at the caption below the photo. It read, "Perfect Sunday networking with the best people. Big things coming for Greg's real estate empire. Feeling so blessed to have a team that supports each other through thick and thin. Family first. Family first." The hashtag mocked me from the screen. They were drinking martinis on a yacht with Greg's wealthy boss, while the man who had raised my father was being lowered into a muddy grave. They had forced me to drain my life savings to pay for a funeral they could not even be bothered to attend. They had let me stand in the freezing rain, making excuses for them to the pastor while they posed for social media photos to boost their fake elite status. I felt a physical snap inside my chest. It was not the agonizing break of a heart shattering. It was the sharp, clean sound of a heavy chain finally being cut. For 31 years, I had lived my life as the invisible daughter. I had accepted the leftover birthday cakes, the ignored phone calls, the constant belittling. I had convinced myself that if I was just useful enough, if I handled the medical bills and the dirty work and the unpleasant tasks that they avoided, they would eventually love me. I thought my sacrifice would buy my place in the Mitchell family. But standing in that cemetery, looking at the bright smiling faces of my parents on that yacht, a wave of profound, absolute cold clarity washed over me. The delusion evaporated completely, leaving behind a stark, undeniable truth. I was not family to them. I was collateral damage. I was a tool to be used and discarded so they could maintain their illusion of perfection. I slid my phone back into my pocket. My hand brushed against the folded paper of the funeral invoice. $9,000. $9,000 of my blood, sweat, and tears sitting in my pocket while they drank expensive liquor on a boat. Thomas Davis was watching me closely. He had seen the shift in my posture. He had seen my eyes go dark. He stepped closer, leaning in, so the pastor would not hear over the sound of the rain. "Did they text you?" he asked quietly. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the mahogany casket. "Yes, they are not coming. They are at a yacht party." Thomas did not look shocked. He let out a slow, heavy breath and adjusted his grip on the umbrella. "Henry told me this would happen," he murmured. "Your grandfather was a very wise man, Clara. He knew exactly who his son was, and he knew exactly who you were. He asked me to prepare for this exact outcome." I turned my head to look at the old lawyer. "What do you mean he asked you to prepare?" "We will discuss it on Wednesday at my office," Thomas replied, his tone shifting to something purely professional and sharply calculated. "I have a meeting scheduled with Richard, Susan, Ashley, and Greg for the formal reading of the will. They have already called my secretary 3 times this week, asking about the commercial land Henry owned. They are extremely eager to get their hands on the inheritance. They think they are getting the land," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "They think they are getting everything Thomas corrected. But Henry left a specific set of instructions. He told me that if they failed to show up today, it would trigger a secondary protocol. I need you to be at my office on Wednesday, Clara. Bring the funeral invoices. Bring the medical bills. Bring everything." I looked back down at the muddy grave. The tears that had been choking me all morning were completely gone. The obedient, silent, dutiful Clara Mitchell died in that cemetery right alongside her grandfather. She was buried under the weight of that $9,000 invoice and the absolute betrayal of a hashtag on a Sunday morning. I took a deep breath of the cold, wet air, letting it fill my lungs. "I will be there. Thomas," I said, my voice ringing with a new, unshakable strength. "And I am bringing the key he gave me." Thomas raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a very faint, grim smile. "Good," he said, "because the Mitchell family is about to learn that actions have consequences." The pastor finished his prayer. The workers began to shovel the earth. I stood tall under the pouring rain, feeling the heavy, wet fabric of my coat against my skin. I was not shrinking anymore. I was not making myself small to make them comfortable. I had spent my entire life paying the price for their arrogance. Now it was their turn to pay, and I was going to collect every single debt. The drive from the cemetery was an absolute blur of gray skies and rhythmic windshield wipers. My heater was broken, blasting only cold air into the cabin of my 10-year-old sedan, but I barely noticed. My skin was already frozen. The damp, heavy fabric of my black funeral dress clung to my legs, an uncomfortable physical reminder of the muddy grave I had just left behind. I steered my car toward Grandfather Henry's house, navigating the familiar, winding roads of the Ohio suburbs. The plan for the afternoon was simple. I needed to secure the property, lock the doors, and retrieve the specific financial documents attorney Thomas Davis had requested. I fully expected to find a quiet, empty house echoing with the heavy, somber silence of grief. Instead, as I turned onto his familiar tree-lined street, my stomach dropped completely into my shoes. Parked carelessly across Grandfather's pristine front lawn, Crushing the bright azalea bushes he had painstakingly tended for a decade, was a massive black luxury SUV. The heavy tires had churned the rain-soaked grass into deep, ugly mud trenches. I knew that vehicle instantly. It belonged to Greg, my arrogant brother-in-law. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. They were supposed to be at a networking yacht party on the other side of the city. Why were they here? And more importantly, how did they beat me here? The answer hit me with a sickening wave of realization. They must have left their elite networking event the minute they received a text from the pastor that the burial was over, realizing that the house was now officially unguarded. They had completely bypassed the cemetery, refusing to stand in the rain to honor a dead man, but they rushed straight to his home to raid it. I parked my car on the street, actively refusing to pull into the driveway. The torrential rain was slowly reducing to a miserable icy drizzle. I walked up the driveway, my wet shoes slapping loudly against the wet concrete. The front door was unlocked and pushed slightly ajar. Grandfather never left his door unlocked. He was a man of strict habits and secure deadbolts. I pushed the door open. The distinct, comforting smell of pine wood and old books that always welcomed me was completely overwhelmed by the sharp, aggressive scent of expensive designer cologne and damp luxury fabrics. I stepped into the foyer, and the sounds hit me like a physical blow. I did not hear the hushed, respectful whispers of mourning family members. Instead, I heard the loud, frantic noises of a burglary in progress. I heard a heavy thud, followed by the distinct sound of splintering wood coming from the back hallway. I walked quietly down the hall, my heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I turned the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. The home office, a room Grandfather had kept meticulously organized for 40 years, looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Books were pulled off the mahogany shelves and thrown carelessly onto the floor. Vintage family photo albums had been dumped upside down, their plastic pages ripped and crumpled. The solid oak desk drawers were yanked completely out of their tracks, their contents scattered wildly across the woven Persian rug. And right in the center of the total chaos were my parents and my sister. They were still wearing their expensive yacht attire. My father Richard had a navy blue cashmere sweater draped over his shoulders, looking like he had just stepped off a golf course. My mother Susan was in a silk nautical-themed dress, her expensive heels tracking dark cemetery mud all over the polished floorboards. Ashley was digging frantically through a cardboard box of old tax returns, her perfect manicure aggressively picking at the fragile yellowed paper. But it was Greg who made the blood rush to my ears and my vision blur with pure rage. He was standing over Grandfather's antique steel filing cabinet, holding a heavy metal crowbar he must have taken from the garage workbench. As I watched in absolute horror, he jammed the iron wedge into the top drawer and pulled back hard. The metal screeched and buckled under the violent force. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the chaotic room like a gunshot. All four of them froze instantly. Greg lowered the crowbar, panting slightly from the physical exertion of breaking and entering. My father turned to face me, looking mildly annoyed rather than caught in the act. He did not look like a grieving son who had just lost his father. He looked exactly like a man interrupted during a bank robbery. "Clara," he said, his tone entirely casual and dismissive. "You startled us. We thought you would be at the church reception for another hour, mingling with the neighbors." "There was no church reception," I replied, staring directly at the ruined filing cabinet. "Because nobody came to the funeral. I stood in the rain alone. What are you doing to his personal things?" Susan let out a dramatic, irritated sigh, dusting off her hands as if she had just finished a tedious chore. "We are looking for the property deeds, Clara. Your grandfather was terribly disorganized in his final months. Greg needs the exact parcel numbers for the commercial plot downtown, so his legal team can start drafting the development permits tomorrow morning. Time is money, and we cannot afford to wait for the courts to sort this out." I looked from my mother to my father and then to Ashley, who had dropped the tax returns and picked up her cell phone. They had skipped his burial to break into his house and hunt for his assets. They could not even wait for his body to be cold in the ground before they started tearing apart the life he had built with his own two hands. Richard rubbed his temples, looking at me as if I were a slow employee holding up a crucial corporate project. "Listen, Clara, we do not have time for a sentimental, emotional meltdown right now. Greg has serious investors breathing down his neck. Be a good girl, Go into the kitchen and make us a pot of coffee, and leave your set of spare house keys on the counter. We need to secure the property from looters." The absolute staggering audacity of his demand hung in the air, pulling the oxygen right out of the room. He wanted me, the daughter who had washed his father's soiled bedsheets and administered his pain medication for agonizing months, to brew coffee for the very people destroying his home. The old Clara, the obedient, invisible daughter who just wanted to keep the peace, would have turned around, walked into the kitchen, and started the coffee maker. She would have handed over the keys and cried quietly in her car while they stole everything. But that girl died at the cemetery. She was buried under $9,000 of funeral debt. I did not move toward the kitchen. I stood my ground, planting my wet shoes firmly on the hardwood floor. "Put the crowbar down, Greg," I said, my voice low and completely steady. Greg scoffed, leaning his significant weight against the damaged cabinet. "Relax, Clara. We are just securing the family assets. You would not understand the legal side of commercial real estate. You process hospital bills for a living. Just go make the coffee and let the adults handle the business." I reached into my wet raincoat and unzipped the inner pocket. I pulled out a thick folded document encased in a clear plastic protective sleeve. Attorney Thomas Davis had given it to me 2 weeks ago, telling me to keep it on me at all times for this exact scenario. I unfolded the heavy paper slowly, making sure every single eye in the room was focused firmly on my hands. "I am not making anyone coffee," I stated, "and none of you are taking a single piece of paper out of this room." Richard took a heavy step forward, his face darkening with sudden aggressive anger. "Clara, do not push my patience today. I am the eldest son. I am the head of this family. Hand over the keys right now before I lose my temper." I held up the document. The bold legal header caught the gray light filtering through the window. "This is a temporary executorship order," I explained, reading the deep confusion forming on their faces. "It was signed by grandfather Henry and notarized by Thomas Davis 3 weeks ago. It grants me immediate absolute legal authority over this entire property and all of its contents the exact second his death certificate was signed." Susan laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed in the ruined office. "That is completely ridiculous. You are just a medical billing clerk. He would never put you in charge of a multi-million-dollar estate. You do not even own your own home." "I am in charge of this house right now," I countered, stepping forward and pointing directly toward the hallway. "And as the legal executor, I am telling you that you have absolutely no legal right to be standing in this room. You did not ask permission. You forced your way inside, and you are intentionally destroying his property. That is called breaking and entering. It is a crime." Greg dropped the crowbar. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy metallic clank that made Ashley jump. "You are bluffing," he sneered, trying to regain his dominant posture. "You would never call the cops on your own parents. You do not have the spine for it." I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed 911, leaving my thumb hovering directly over the bright green call button. "You have exactly 60 seconds to walk out that front door before I request a squad car to report 4 intruders vandalizing a deceased man's home. Do you really want your wealthy yacht friends reading about your arrest for burglary in the local paper tomorrow morning?" The threat of public humiliation was the only language my family truly understood. Susan went completely rigid, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Richard stared at my phone, realizing I was absolutely serious. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently, I could almost feel the air pressure change. Ashley stepped forward, her face twisted with pure venom. "You are completely delusional, Clara. You think a piece of paper makes you important. You are nothing but a pathetic hourly worker. You will never be anything else. We are taking this to court and my husband is going to crush you. We will leave you bankrupt." I looked at my golden child sister. Her designer dress was perfectly tailored, her makeup was flawless, and her soul was entirely empty. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I just looked at her with pure, unadulterated pity. 50 seconds, I said, my thumb pressing slightly closer to the screen. Richard grabbed Susan's arm roughly. "Let us go," he muttered, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "She has lost her mind. We will let the lawyers handle her on Wednesday. She cannot fight our legal team." They pushed past me in the narrow hallway. Greg glared at me as he walked by, his fists clenched, but he did not say a single word. Ashley bumped her shoulder hard against mine, a petty, childish physical gesture, but I stood like a stone pillar. I absorbed the impact without moving an inch. I followed them out to the foyer, watching as they marched out onto the front porch and back into the freezing rain. I gripped the heavy oak door. Richard turned back on the porch, opening his mouth to issue one last intimidating threat. I slammed the door directly in his face. The loud crack echoed through the entire house, shaking the picture frames on the walls. I reached up and turned the heavy brass deadbolt, locking them out of Grandfather Henry's world forever. I stood in the quiet foyer, leaning my back against the solid wood. My heart was racing, but my hands were completely steady. The silence of the house finally returned, wrapping around me like a protective blanket. I walked back into the home office, looking at the massive mess they had left behind. The ruined cabinet, the scattered files, the dark mud tracked across the floor. I knelt down beside the broken desk and began to carefully clean up the wreckage. I had a long night ahead of me, and I had a feeling that whatever was hiding in Grandfather's locked wooden toolbox out in the garage was going to change all of our lives permanently. The house was completely silent when I finally turned the heavy brass deadbolt, locking my family out in the freezing rain. For a long moment, I just stood in the dimly lit foyer, leaning my back against the solid wood door. My heart was racing a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were surprisingly steady. The chaotic energy my parents and sister had brought into the home was gone, replaced by the familiar, comforting scent of pine wood and old books. I took a deep breath and walked slowly back toward the home office. The destruction they had left behind in their frantic search for the property deeds made my stomach churn. Vintage family photo albums were tossed onto the floor with their fragile pages torn. Grandfather's favorite leather armchair was shoved carelessly into a corner. The heavy steel filing cabinet was hopelessly dented from where Greg had attacked it with a crowbar. It felt like a profound physical violation of a man who could no longer defend his own space. I spent the next 2 hours quietly putting the room back together. I smoothed out the crumpled photographs, picked up the scattered books, and returned the tax files to their proper boxes. The physical act of cleaning felt grounding. It gave me time to process the absolute cruelty I had just witnessed. They had skipped the burial of their own flesh and blood to raid his home like common thieves. When the office was finally restored to some semblance of order, I walked into the kitchen and turned on the overhead light. I remembered the small brass key Grandfather had pressed into my hand during his final days. He had been so specific about his instructions. He told me to look for a heavy wooden toolbox locked beneath his workbench in the garage. He told me there was a false bottom inside. I walked out the side door into the attached garage. The space was cold and smelled faintly of motor oil and sawdust. It was completely untouched by my family's raid. They had been too focused on the obvious places, the desk and the filing cabinets, to bother looking in a messy workspace. I found the toolbox exactly where he said it would be, pushed deep into the shadows beneath the heavy wooden workbench. I pulled it out into the center of the concrete floor. It was covered in years of dust and grime. I inserted the small brass key into the padlock. It turned with the satisfying mechanical click. I opened the lid. The top tray was filled with ordinary items: rusty wrenches, a collection of mismatched screwdrivers, a few rolls of electrical tape. I lifted the heavy metal tray out and set it on the floor. The bottom compartment appeared to be completely empty, just a flat sheet of dark stained wood. I ran my fingers along the inside edges, pressing firmly against the corners, just as Grandfather had instructed. There was a soft click, and the wooden bottom popped up slightly. I lifted the false panel away. Hidden beneath the wood, wrapped securely in thick plastic sleeves, were 3 large manila envelopes. They were heavy, packed tightly with paper. I pulled them out of the box, my pulse quickening. I carried the envelopes back inside the house, straight to the large oak dining table in the kitchen. I sat down and carefully opened the first envelope. I slid the contents out onto the table, spreading the papers under the bright kitchen light. This is what I do for a living. Every single day at the hospital, I work as a medical billing specialist. I spend 8 to 10 hours a day digging through incredibly complex insurance claims, finding hidden financial discrepancies, tracking down where the money originated, where it went, and exactly why it was moved. I know how to read a financial document like a forensic investigator. Doing it with personal bank statements was second nature to me. The first document I found was the original formation paperwork for the Henry Mitchell Medical Care Trust. The initial funding balance, printed clearly at the top of the page, was exactly $200,000. The date on the document was 3 years ago, right around the time my grandfather received his first serious heart failure diagnosis. He had sold a piece of commercial property and set this specific money aside explicitly to cover his end-of-life care, his private nursing needs, and his expensive out-of-pocket medications. He had trusted his only son to manage it. He had signed a document granting my father a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. I moved to the next stack of papers. These were the monthly banking statements for the trust account printed and mailed every 30 days. I placed a blank legal pad on the table and picked up a pen. I started meticulously tracing the outflows. The first few months looked completely normal and legally sound. There were standard payments to a local pharmacy, a specialized cardiologist, and a medical supply company for oxygen equipment. But by month 4, the entire pattern shifted dramatically. The legitimate medical expenses became sparse and infrequent. Instead, I saw a series of flat, even number wire transfers moving directly from the medical trust into a joint checking account owned by Richard and Susan Mitchell. $5,000 here, $8,000 there. I kept digging. Grandfather had somehow managed to obtain copies of my parents' personal credit card statements and checking account ledgers. He had folded them together with the trust statements cross-referencing the theft. I matched the dates on my legal pad. The money flowed out of the trust into my parents' account, and within 48 hours, it was completely gone again, spent on things that had absolutely nothing to do with healthcare. Where did the money go? It went to fund a luxury lifestyle they could never realistically afford on my father's middle management salary. I traced a $7,000 withdrawal directly to the initiation fee and quarterly dues at the elite Oak Creek Country Club, the exact same country club where my mother spent her afternoons sipping expensive wine and pretending to be old money to impress her wealthy friends. I traced another $4,000 to a high-end designer boutique downtown. The date on the receipt matched the exact week my mother bought a new luxury handbag. It was a bag she had proudly paraded around at family dinners, claiming she had saved up her own money for an entire year to buy it. She had not saved a single penny for it. She had bought it with the money meant for my grandfather's oxygen tanks. The nausea in my stomach twisted into something incredibly hot and sharp. My hands moved faster, sorting through the final year of statements. The withdrawals grew larger, more aggressive, and far more frequent. The trust account was practically hemorrhaging cash. And then I found the largest transfers of all. Over a period of 4 months last year, there were 3 massive wire transfers authorized out of the trust. $15,000, $20,000, and a final devastating blow of $25,000, $60,000 total. The destination for these transfers was not a luxury boutique or a country club membership. It was a national commercial mortgage lending company. I stared at the account routing numbers on the wire transfer receipts. I recognized the name of the lender immediately. Greg had aggressively bragged about securing a massive loan from them to buy the sprawling 5-bedroom house he and Ashley lived in. But the housing market had shifted over the past year, and Greg's risky commercial real estate investments had been taking huge financial hits. I remembered a dinner party where he had drank too much expensive scotch and complained bitterly about being over-leveraged and completely underwater on his primary residence. They were drowning in massive debt. Their precious mansion was on the verge of foreclosure, so my parents threw them a financial lifeline. They used my dying grandfather's medical trust fund to bail out the golden child and her arrogant husband. They took the money that could have paid for round-the-clock professional nursing care and used it to save a house that was far too big for 2 people anyway. I pulled out the very last statement in the envelope. It had been printed just 1 week ago. The medical trust account balance was 0. It was completely and entirely empty. I dropped my pen. It clattered loudly against the solid wood table. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming magnitude of the betrayal. I thought about the days I had literally skipped meals just to afford his hospital copays. I thought about standing in the pharmacy earlier that week, deeply humiliated and terrified because my checking account had exactly $12 left in it. I had been carrying the entire physical and financial burden of his passing while my family actively robbed him blind to fund their fake wealthy aesthetic. They had turned my grandfather's impending death into their own personal lottery payout. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat at the kitchen table until the black sky outside the window slowly turned into the bruised gray light of a rainy Ohio dawn. I carefully organized every single bank statement, every wire transfer receipt, and every credit card bill back into the manila envelopes. I placed the envelopes into my worn leather work tote. I took a quick shower, changed into my only good professional suit, and walked out the door. Downtown Ohio was just waking up as I drove toward the financial district. The streets were slick with fresh rain reflecting the red glow of the traffic lights. I parked in the garage beneath the tall glass building that housed the law offices of Sterling and Davis. I rode the elevator to the 14th floor, my grip on my leather tote so incredibly tight my fingers ached. The receptionist seemed surprised to see me there so early, but when I said my name, she immediately buzzed me through the heavy glass doors. Attorney Thomas Davis was already sitting at his massive desk, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. He looked up as I entered, his expression completely unreadable and deeply professional. "Clara," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. "Please sit down." I did not sit. I unzipped my tote bag and pulled out the thick stack of envelopes. I dropped them directly onto the center of his immaculate desk. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. "I know exactly what they did," I said, my voice trembling slightly before finding its solid footing. "I found the documents in the garage toolbox. They drained the entire medical trust. $200,000, Thomas. They stole all of it. Richard used his power of attorney to fund country club memberships and luxury shopping sprees. They bailed out Greg and Ashley when their house was underwater. I have the paper trail. I have all the proof right here. We need to call the police immediately. This is grand theft and elder abuse." I braced myself, waiting for the seasoned attorney to express profound shock or outrage. I waited for him to reach for his desk phone and demand a police dispatch. Instead, Thomas Davis took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He set the mug down, folded his hands over the manila envelopes, and looked at me with a deep, profound sorrow in his eyes. "I know, Clara," he said, his voice gentle, but incredibly firm. I froze. My mind struggled to process the two simple words. "What do you mean you know?" Thomas let out a long, weary sigh. "Henry and I discovered the missing funds 6 months ago. We did an annual review of his estate planning, and I noticed the massive discrepancies in the trust account. When I brought the ledger to your grandfather, he broke down. It was the only time in 30 years of friendship I ever saw that proud man cry. He realized his own son was robbing him to pay for a country club lifestyle while you were working yourself to the bone to buy his groceries. My legs suddenly felt like heavy lead. I sank into the leather chair, staring at the attorney in utter disbelief. If you knew 6 months ago, why did you not stop them? Why did you not go to the authorities? We could have put Richard in a jail cell. Because Henry explicitly forbade it, Thomas replied, leaning forward, putting his elbows on the desk. He stopped me from calling the authorities. He knew that if we involved the police, it would become a messy, highly public criminal trial. Richard would hire expensive defense lawyers. He would claim he was just borrowing the money to manage the estate. He would drag the legal process out for years and claim misunderstanding or accidental financial mismanagement. He might have ended up with a plea deal and a simple slap on the wrist. I shook my head, unable to comprehend the logic. So he just let them keep stealing? No, Thomas said, his eyes narrowing sharply. He let them keep digging their own graves. Your grandfather told me that putting Richard in a jail cell was far too easy. He wanted to strip them of the very thing they valued most in this entire world, their money, their social status, and their massive pride. He wanted total, absolute financial ruin. Thomas opened one of his own desk drawers and pulled out a pristine blue folder. He slid it across the smooth surface of the desk toward me. Henry asked me to draft a very specific legal trap, Thomas explained, tapping the blue folder with his index finger. 6 months ago, Richard came into this office demanding to sign a new batch of release forms for the trust account. He was in a hurry as usual. He did not read the fine print. He just signed exactly where I told him to sign. What did he sign? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Thomas offered a cold, tight smile that sent a literal shiver down my spine. He signed a document reclassifying every single dollar withdrawn from that medical trust, not as a family gift, but as a formal high-interest loan. And because he was acting as a fiduciary, he unknowingly pledged his own primary residence, his precious country club estate, as the collateral for that debt. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I stared at the blue folder, my mind racing to put the pieces together. Henry orchestrated the entire thing. Thomas continued leaning back in his chair. He knew they would eventually drain the account to absolute zero. He wanted them to feel safe, to feel completely victorious. But on Wednesday, when they walk into this office expecting to inherit millions of dollars in commercial real estate, they are going to find out that they actually owe the estate $200,000 payable immediately. And Clara, you are the sole executor and the sole beneficiary of that estate. I sat in the chair, the full weight of my grandfather's brilliant, devastating plan crushing over me like a tidal wave. He had suffered in absolute silence. He had watched me struggle. Also, he could set up a legal checkmate, so absolute that my parents would never ever recover from the fallout. I will see you on Wednesday, Clara Thomas said softly. Bring your absolute worst, because they deserve nothing less. Wednesday afternoon arrived with a brilliant, blinding sunshine that felt entirely out of place. The torrential, freezing rain that had soaked my grandfather's funeral was completely gone, replaced by crisp autumn air and clear blue skies. I walked into the downtown law offices of attorney Thomas Davis exactly 30 minutes before the scheduled reading of the will. I wore the same simple, dark professional suit I wore to my hospital job. I carried my worn leather work tote, which held the heavily audited bank statements, the wire transfer receipts, and the medical bills. I sat in a high-backed leather chair in the corner of the expansive conference room, waiting in absolute silence. The conference room was an intimidating space, designed to project power and wealth. A massive polished mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by plush executive chairs. One entire wall was made of floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking the bustling city center below. I watched the tiny cars moving through the intersections, feeling strangely detached from the world outside. My heart rate was slow and steady. My breathing was perfectly controlled. The crushing anxiety that had plagued my entire existence in the Mitchell family had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying absolute calm. At exactly 10 minutes before 2 o'clock, the heavy frosted glass doors of the suite swung open. The noise hit the quiet professional atmosphere of the law firm like a physical assault. My family did not simply walk into the office. They paraded into it. They strutted through the reception area, oozing a level of arrogance and greedy entitlement that made the receptionist physically recoil. Greg entered first, walking with the aggressive, wide-shouldered swagger of a man who firmly believed he owned every room he stepped into. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit with a bright red silk tie, loudly barking into his cell phone. He did not bother to lower his voice to a professional volume. He paced directly into the conference room, completely ignoring my presence in the corner as he aggressively negotiated his grand plans. "Listen to me, Dave," Greg boomed into the phone, waving his free hand emphatically in the air. "The zoning on that downtown plot is already registered for commercial mixed use. I am telling you, we bring the bulldozers in by the end of next month. We level that ancient, dilapidated hardware store, and we clear the entire foundation before the ground freezes. We can fit a massive 3-story retail center on that plot with premium luxury apartments on the top floor." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to my brother-in-law loudly outline the destruction of my grandfather's legacy. He was literally planning to tear down the building where grandfather Henry had worked for 40 years, where he had built a life and a reputation in this community before the man's will had even been officially read. Greg laughed, a sharp, greedy sound that echoed off the glass walls. "Do not worry about the capital, Dave," he told the person on the other end of the line. "The financing is practically guaranteed. We are walking into a massive liquid inheritance today." The old man was sitting on an absolute goldmine and had no idea how to leverage it. "I will have the deed transferred to my holding company by Friday. Start drawing up the anchor tenant contracts now." He finally snapped his phone shut and dropped it onto the polished mahogany table with a heavy thud. He pulled out the best chair at the center of the table and slouched into it, spreading his arms wide over the armrests like a king claiming his throne. Right behind him, my mother, Susan, and my sister, Ashley, strolled through the doorway. They were practically vibrating with giddy excitement. They looked like they were arriving at a luxury spa resort rather than a legal proceeding regarding the death of a family member. Susan was wearing a pristine white cashmere sweater and a string of genuine pearls. Ashley carried an oversized designer tote bag that probably cost more than my car. Susan did not even glance at the head of the table where Attorney Davis would soon sit. Instead, she immediately pulled a stack of glossy high-end architectural and interior design magazines out of Ashley's tote bag and dropped them onto the conference table. Ashley leaned over her mother's shoulder, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. "Mom, I am telling you, the imported Italian marble is the only way to go for your kitchen expansion," Ashley said, pointing a manicured finger at a full-page spread. "If we are going to host the annual Country Club Holiday Gala this year, the house needs a complete overhaul. That old granite you have right now is completely outdated." Susan nodded vigorously, flipping the pages with aggressive enthusiasm. "You are absolutely right, sweetie. And with the liquid assets we are getting today, we do not have to settle for the domestic materials. I want the custom cabinetry imported directly from Europe. When Brenda sees the new layout, she's going to absolutely choke with jealousy. She thinks her new pool deck makes her the queen of the neighborhood. We are going to blow her entirely out of the water." They giggled together, a high-pitched conspiratorial sound that made the skin on the back of my neck crawl. They were actively spending the money they had stolen from a dying man to win a petty imaginary war against their country club neighbors. They had not shed a single tear. They had not worn black. They had skipped standing in the freezing rain to watch his casket be lowered into the mud, and now they were casually planning kitchen renovations over his unread will. It was only then that Susan finally noticed me sitting in the corner. Her smile dropped for a fraction of a second, quickly replaced by a look of mild irritation. She looked at me, the way someone looks at a piece of misplaced furniture. I was wearing a simple dark suit, my hair pulled back neatly. I did not fit into their glossy, wealthy aesthetic. I was the inconvenient reminder of the dirty work they had completely avoided. Clara Susan sighed, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "Do you really have to sit right there staring at us? You are making the atmosphere incredibly depressing. Move over to that smaller chair by the water cooler. Ashley and I need the space on this side of the room to spread out our design swatches." The old Clara would have immediately stood up, apologized profusely for taking up too much oxygen, and scurried over to the worst seat in the room. The old Clara would have swallowed the humiliation to keep the peace. I did not move a single inch. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, my expression completely blank. "I am fine, exactly where I am," I said. My voice was low, even, and perfectly steady. Susan blinked clearly, taken aback by the quiet, absolute refusal. She opened her mouth to snap an order at me, but before she could speak, my father, Richard, walked into the conference room. Richard had clearly decided to play the role of the dignified, grieving son. He was wearing a dark tailored suit, his hair perfectly combed. He held a linen handkerchief in his left hand, occasionally dabbing at his completely dry eyes for dramatic effect. He walked over to Attorney Thomas Davis, who had just entered the room through a private side door carrying a thick leather binder. Richard reached out and gripped the attorney's hand with a practiced look of profound sorrow. "Thomas, my friend," Richard said, his voice dropping an octave to sound appropriately mournful. "I cannot tell you what a brutal, agonizing week this has been for our family. Losing Dad so suddenly, it has just devastated us." I watched the performance with a clinical, detached fascination. My father had not seen his own dad in over 4 months. He had ignored dozens of my frantic phone calls. He had spent the morning of the funeral drinking martinis on a luxury yacht. And yet here he was, squeezing the lawyer's hand and pretending his heart was completely broken. Thomas Davis was a master of his profession. His face remained perfectly impassive, revealing absolutely nothing of the rage I knew was boiling just beneath the surface. He smoothly extracted his hand from Richard's grip and walked toward the head of the conference table. "It is always difficult when the end finally comes," Thomas said, his tone neutral and strictly professional. "Please, everyone take your seats. We have a significant amount of legal ground to cover this afternoon." Richard nodded solemnly and took the seat right next to Greg. He adjusted his suit jacket and let out a heavy, performative sigh. "Dad went so suddenly," Richard continued, leaning back and looking around the room as if addressing an audience. "But he and I had a deep understanding. We bumped heads sometimes, sure, but he knew that when the time came, I would step up. He knew I had the business acumen to manage the family legacy properly and take our investments to the next level. Greg slapped my father on the shoulder, a loud, booming gesture of solidarity. Absolutely, Richard. Henry was old school, but he was not stupid. He knew you needed real sharks to survive in today's commercial market. We are going to take that dusty old portfolio of his and turn it into an absolute empire. We are honoring him by maximizing the profit margins. I sat in my chair, watching them stroke each other's enormous egos. I felt like a scientist observing a highly predictable and deeply flawed experiment. They were so utterly blinded by their own greed and their own arrogance that they could not read the temperature of the room. They did not notice that Attorney Davis had not offered a single word of condolence. They did not notice that he had not offered them water or coffee. And they completely failed to notice the terrifying absolute silence radiating from my corner of the room. I did not glare at them. I did not cry. I did not interrupt their boasting. I just watched them. My calmness seemed to unsettle Ashley. She kept glancing over at me, her brow furrowing in confusion. Usually by this point in a family gathering, I would be anxiously offering to fetch drinks or nervously trying to join the conversation. But today, I was a stone wall. Why are you just sitting there staring like a creep? Ashley finally snapped, tossing her glossy magazine onto the table. You look like you are at a funeral. We are literally at a will reading, Ashley. I replied, my voice completely devoid of inflection. A funeral is exactly what this is about. Or did you forget that part while you were picking out imported Italian marble? Ashley flushed a bright, angry red. Listen here, you little administrative clerk, she hissed, leaning across the table. Just because you chose to play Florence Nightingale for the last few months does not mean you get to act superior to us. We were handling the big picture. We were securing the future of this family. Susan immediately jumped in to defend her golden child. Do not speak to your sister that way, Clara. You have been walking around with a massive chip on your shoulder all week. We understand you are tired from working your little hospital job, but you do not get to project your financial insecurities onto us. We are here to handle high-level estate business today. Just sit quietly and let the adults manage the situation. I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had told me to put life-saving heart medication on a maxed-out credit card while she bought a designer dress. I looked at the woman who had secretly siphoned a dying man's trust fund to pay for her country club dues. You are right, Mum, I said, my voice dropping to a chilling whisper that forced the entire room to quiet down just to hear me. We are here to handle high-level estate business. I am going to sit very quietly, and I am going to watch you handle it. Susan frowned, clearly unnerved by my response, but entirely unable to figure out why. She dismissed me with an eye roll and turned her attention back to the lawyer. Thomas Davis sat at the head of the table. He opened his thick leather binder with slow, deliberate precision. The room immediately fell into a hushed, greedy silence. Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, cracking his knuckles in anticipation. Richard sat up straight, adjusting his tie, ready to accept his multi-million-dollar crown. Ashley and Susan put their design magazines away, pulling out identical leather-bound notebooks, ready to write down the exact dollar amounts they were about to receive. They were absolutely entirely certain of their victory. They had spent their entire lives treating people like stepping stones, assuming that there would never be any real consequences. They believed that their wealth and their social status made them completely invincible. They believed that because I was quiet and because grandfather Henry was old, they could simply steamroll over us without a second thought. They had no idea that they were sitting inside a perfectly constructed legal trap. They had no idea that every single boast, every arrogant demand, and every cruel dismissal they had uttered over the past 3 years had been meticulously documented. I sat in my corner chair, my hands resting lightly on the leather tote bag that held the financial autopsy of their massive crimes. I did not need to scream or cry or demand respect anymore. I did not need to beg them to see my value. The time for shrinking was over. The time for keeping the peace was completely finished. Attorney Thomas Davis looked around the room. His eyes swept over Richard, Greg, Susan, and Ashley, taking in their eager, hungry expressions. Finally, his gaze landed on me. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. "Let us begin," Thomas said, his voice echoing clearly against the glass walls of the conference room. He did not reach for the standard, thick stack of legal papers that comprised the primary will. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a small plain white envelope sealed firmly with dark red wax. Before we address the formal distribution of the estate assets, Thomas announced, holding the sealed envelope up so the entire table could see it. Henry left extremely specific instructions regarding this proceeding. He required that before any legal documents are processed, I must read his final personal statement aloud to the immediate family. Richard smiled a condescending, patronizing smile. Of course, Thomas. Dad always loved having the last word. Go ahead. We are all ears. We want to hear his final advice for the business. I watched Thomas slide a silver letter opener beneath the red wax seal. The quiet tearing of the heavy paper sounded incredibly loud in the tense silence of the room. He extracted a single sheet of handwritten stationery. I looked at my parents. I looked at their confident, arrogant smiles. I took a slow, deep breath, locking every single detail of their smug faces into my memory. I wanted to remember exactly what they looked like in this very last second before their entire world collapsed. Thomas unfolded the letter, smoothed it flat against the mahogany table, and began to read. The sharp, brittle crack of the dark red wax seal breaking echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet conference room. Everyone jumped slightly, except for me. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the scene unfold with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. Attorney Thomas Davis did not reach for the massive leather-bound binder that normally contained a standard estate portfolio. He completely ignored the thick stack of legal documents sitting in the center of his desk. Instead, his weathered hands carefully unfolded the single sheet of thick, textured stationery he had just pulled from that smaller envelope. My father shifted in his plush executive chair, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. The smug, confident smile he had worn since walking through the glass doors faltered for a fraction of a second. "Thomas," my father said, his voice laced with a sudden nervous impatience. "What exactly is that? We are here to read the final will and testament. I have developers waiting on a conference call in an hour to discuss the commercial property downtown." Thomas smoothed the creases of the paper against the polished mahogany table. His face was a mask of absolute unyielding professional granite. "This dictates which will we are legally obligated to read today, Richard," he replied, his tone dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Henry left very specific binding instructions. "I am required by law to read his final personal statement aloud to you, your wife, and your daughter before any formal assets are distributed." My mother, Susan, let out a sharp, irritated breath. Her expensive nautical-themed silk dress rustled as she crossed her arms over her chest. "Well, then read it," she snapped. "Let us get this over with. I'm sure Henry just wanted to impart some folksy wisdom about hard work and family values." Thomas adjusted his reading glasses. He did not look at my mother. He did not look at my father. He looked down at the handwritten page and began to read my grandfather's final words. The voice of a dead man suddenly filled the sprawling corporate space, carrying a weight that forced everyone to sit perfectly still. Richard, Susan, and Ashley Thomas read his voice steady and commanding. "When this letter is opened, I know with absolute scientific certainty that you chose a party over my funeral." The air vanished from the room. My father's face lost all its color, draining to a sickly pale gray. Susan's hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Ashley, who had been casually scrolling through her phone just seconds before, froze completely. Her thumb hovered uselessly over the screen. Thomas did not pause. He continued reading the words my grandfather had penned with a dying but brilliant mind. "I know you are sitting in Thomas Davis's office right now, wearing your expensive clothes, smelling of fine cologne, and waiting to inherit a multi-million-dollar empire. You believe you have successfully navigated my passing with minimal inconvenience to your country club social calendar. You believe you're incredibly smart. You are not." Greg, my arrogant brother-in-law, let out a forced, uncomfortable chuckle. He tugged at his bright red silk tie, looking around the room as if expecting someone to hand him a punchline. "What kind of morbid joke is this?" he muttered. Thomas ignored him entirely. His eyes tracked across the handwritten lines, delivering the devastating truth with surgical precision. "How do I know you're sitting there empty-handed?" Henry's letter continued, "Because if you had possessed the basic human decency to stand in the freezing rain at my graveside this morning, Thomas would have handed you a completely different document. If you had shown up to honor the father who funded your life, you would have received will document number 1. The silence that followed those words was absolute and terrifying. The only sound in the entire corporate suite was the soft hum of the central air conditioning. I watched the realization crash over my family in real time. They had literally been 20 minutes away from the cemetery. They had chosen to drive in the opposite direction to sip martinis on a luxury yacht with a wealthy real estate boss. Will document number 1 was highly generous, the letter explained. It contained a very fair and equitable division of my assets. It would have transferred the commercial plot downtown to Richard. It would have cleared the underwater mortgage on Ashley's sprawling mansion. It would have secured your financial futures permanently. All you had to do was show up. All you had to do was stand in the mud for 20 minutes and say goodbye to me. But I knew you would not. I knew you would leave Clara standing in the rain completely alone to bury me. Greg dropped his custom-engraved silver pen. It hit the polished mahogany table with a loud clack and rolled slowly off the edge, bouncing onto the carpeted floor. He did not bend down to pick it up. His jaw hung slightly open, his eyes darting frantically between Thomas and my father. "Dad!" Susan whispered, her voice trembling violently. "Richard, tell him to stop reading this. This is completely insane. He was sick. He was heavily medicated." Thomas raised his head, looking directly at my mother with a gaze so fiercely cold it made her shrink back into her chair. "I am legally obligated to finish this statement, Susan," he said. "Do not interrupt me again." He looked back down at the stationery. "And so because of your absence, because you chose your fake elite networking event over your own flesh and blood, will document number 1 has been permanently shredded and incinerated. By failing to attend my burial, you have officially and irreversibly activated will document number 2. My father gripped his chest. He looked like a man struggling to draw oxygen into his lungs. "What does that mean?" he choked out. "What is document number 2? Thomas set the handwritten letter carefully to the side. He reached into his leather binder and pulled out a thick, stapled legal packet. The official seal of the state was stamped clearly on the front page. He opened it, smoothing the heavy parchment. "I will now read the binding terms of will document number 2, executed and filed with the county court," Thomas announced. "I, Henry Mitchell, being of sound mind and body, hereby revoke all previous testamentary documents. I leave 0% of my commercial real estate holdings to my son, Richard Mitchell. I leave 0% of my liquid assets to my daughter-in-law, Susan Mitchell. I leave absolutely nothing to my granddaughter, Ashley, or her husband, Greg." Ashley let out a sharp, high-pitched gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Her eyes were wide with a sudden catastrophic panic. Instead, Thomas continued, his voice rising slightly in volume to command the shifting, chaotic energy of the room. "I hereby bequeath 100% of the downtown commercial land, the family residence, all checking and savings accounts, all investment portfolios, and all physical assets exclusively to my granddaughter, Clara Mitchell. Clara is the sole executor and the sole absolute beneficiary of my entire estate." The room exploded. It was not a gradual buildup of tension. It was a massive, instantaneous eruption of pure, unadulterated fury. My mother jumped to her feet, kicking her executive chair so hard it rolled backward and slammed into the glass wall. "No," she screamed, her face turning a violently mottled shade of purple. "No, that is impossible. He cannot do that. That land belongs to Richard. That land has been in the family for 40 years. You cannot just give a multi-million-dollar commercial plot to a low-level hospital clerk." She manipulated him. Greg was on his feet right beside her, his heavy fist slamming down onto the mahogany table. "This is blatant, massive fraud," he roared, pointing a thick, aggressive finger directly at my face. "You brainwashed a dying man, Clara. You isolated him in that house. You made yourself his only caregiver so you could poison his mind against us. We are going to contest this garbage. We are going to drag you through probate court until you are completely bankrupt." My father was hyperventilating. He grabbed the edge of the table, trying to steady his trembling legs. "Thomas, you cannot allow this," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. My father was on heavy narcotics for his heart failure. He was completely out of his mind in those final months. He did not know what he was signing. He lacked basic legal capacity. This will is entirely invalid. I sat in my corner chair, watching the absolute meltdown of the Mitchell family. I felt no fear. I felt no intimidation. I just felt a profound, unshakable sense of justice. For 31 years, they had treated me like dirt beneath their shoes. They had forced me to drain my life savings to buy his medicine while they bought designer clothes. They had mocked my job, my car, and my life. Now they were screaming and begging, realizing that their entire future had just been handed to the daughter they threw away. Attorney Thomas Davis did not yell back. He did not match their frantic, chaotic energy. He simply reached into his thick leather binder for the third and final time. He pulled out a massive heavy stack of medical files. There had to be at least 200 pages bound together with a thick black clip. He lifted the heavy stack and dropped it directly onto the center of the conference table. The incredibly loud thud echoed like a gavel striking a judge's block. The room went instantly quiet again. Greg stared at the medical files, his chest heaving. If you attempt to contest this will, in any court in this state, you will be completely humiliated and financially ruined, Thomas said, his voice radiating a cold, lethal authority. Your grandfather anticipated exactly what you would say today. He knew you would cry elder abuse. He knew you would scream fraud. And he knew you would claim he was medically incompetent. Thomas tapped the thick stack of files with his index finger. These are comprehensive independent psychiatric evaluations, Thomas explained. For the last 6 months of his life, Henry requested weekly cognitive assessments from Dr. Stephen Park, the foremost geriatric psychiatrist in the state of Ohio. We did not rely on a single doctor's opinion. We brought in 2 independent neurologists and a court-appointed legal advocate to verify his absolute mental clarity. Susan shook her head desperately, refusing to accept the reality crashing down on her. They are fake, she stammered. Anyone can buy a doctor's signature. Thomas smiled a grim, humorless expression that showed entirely too many teeth. We also recorded the signing, he added smoothly. We have a continuous high-definition 2-hour video recording of Henry reviewing every single clause of will document number 2. In the video, he explicitly details your financial abuse, your constant absence, and his specific, irrefutable desire to leave you absolutely nothing. The court advocate is present in the video, questioning him thoroughly. He passes every single legal benchmark for testamentary capacity with flying colors. Greg took a slow, stumbling step backward. The arrogant, aggressive posture he had carried into the room completely melted away. He suddenly looked like a very small, very terrified man. His grand plans for a massive retail center, his promises to his wealthy investors, his entire inflated identity had just been incinerated by a dead man. You have absolutely no grounds for a legal challenge, Thomas continued, looking directly into my father's eyes. The medical documentation is bulletproof. The legal documentation is ironclad. And if you attempt to file a frivolous lawsuit to tie up these assets, I have been instructed by the estate to immediately release the video recording of Henry, detailing your theft to every single member of your elite country club and every real estate investor Greg works with. The multi-million-dollar windfall they had spent years banking on evaporated into thin air. It was completely gone. Ashley collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands, and began to sob loudly. This time the tears were absolutely real. They were tears of profound selfish devastation. She had spent her entire life having everything handed to her on a silver platter. Now the silver platter belonged to me, and she had absolutely no idea how to survive without it. My father stared at the mahogany table, his shoulders slumped, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked utterly defeated. The man who had dismissed me as a pathetic, dramatic burden just a week ago was now entirely at my mercy. My mother, Susan, stood frozen, her hands still gripping the edge of the table. Her designer dress suddenly looked incredibly foolish and out of place in a room where she had just been stripped of her entire future. She looked slowly across the expanse of the conference room until her eyes finally met mine. For the very first time in my entire life, she did not look at me with mild irritation or condescending pity. She looked at me with absolute sheer terror. She realized in that exact moment that the obedient, invisible daughter who always kept the peace was completely gone. I was the sole owner of the land they desperately needed. I was the sole owner of the wealth they craved, and I owed them absolutely nothing. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just sat in my chair looking back at her, knowing that the real punishment, the absolute crushing devastation of their financial crimes, had not even truly begun yet. Because attorney Thomas Davis still had one more document left in his binder. and it was going to cost them their very own home. The atmosphere inside the glass-walled conference room was entirely suffocating. You could practically hear the shattered pieces of my parents' massive egos hitting the polished mahogany floor. My mother, Susan, was sitting completely frozen, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles looked like polished bone. My father, Richard, was staring blankly at the wall, his breathing shallow and rapid. The multi-million-dollar commercial property they had mentally spent 10 times over was permanently gone. They were walking away with absolutely nothing. For a normal greedy family, finding out you were disinherited would be the absolute worst moment of your life. But my grandfather, Henry, was a thorough man, and he knew exactly how deep my parents' financial crimes ran. He knew that simply cutting them out of the will was not enough of a punishment. The nightmare for my parents was not over. In fact, the true horror of their situation was only just beginning. Attorney Thomas Davis smoothly closed the thick leather binder that held the primary will. He did not offer any sympathetic glances or comforting words. He simply reached over to a secondary stack of files resting near his coffee mug. He pulled out a slender gray folder that looked entirely unassuming. "We are not quite finished, Richard," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence like a freshly sharpened blade. "There is an addendum to the estate that requires our immediate attention. It concerns a highly specific financial matter regarding the medical trust fund established for Henry's end-of-life care." My father's head snapped up. A new wave of panic washed over his pale face. He shifted uncomfortably in his plush executive chair, tugging at the collar of his expensive dress shirt. "The medical trust?" he stammered nervously. "What about it? That account was depleted paying for his final expenses. I managed it myself as his legal power of attorney. There is nothing left in there to discuss." Thomas adjusted his reading glasses. "That is exactly what we need to discuss, Richard. The fact that the account is entirely empty." I watched my father swallow hard. The bravado he had carried into the room just an hour ago was completely gone, replaced by the shifty, frantic energy of a cornered animal. My mother leaned forward, her eyes darting between her husband and the attorney. Ashley and Greg remained painfully silent, sensing that another catastrophic blow was about to land. "As you all know," Thomas continued opening the gray folder, "Henry established a trust fund 3 years ago, containing exactly $200,000. This money was explicitly earmarked for his private nursing needs, advanced medical equipment, and out-of-pocket pharmaceutical costs. Henry entrusted you, Richard, with a financial and medical power of attorney to manage these funds responsibly." "I did manage them responsibly," my father interrupted, his voice rising defensively. "Healthcare is expensive, Thomas. You have no idea what things cost these days. The money went to his care." Thomas did not argue. He simply pulled a thick printed spreadsheet from the folder. It was an exact duplicate of the audit I had performed in grandfather's kitchen the night before. Henry was an old-school businessman, Richard. He kept meticulous records. He tracked every single cent that left that account. And I have the fully audited ledger right here. Thomas began to read from the spreadsheet, and with every word he spoke, my parents' carefully constructed wealthy facade crumbled a little more. He read the dates and the exact dollar amounts of the wire transfers. He read the payments sent directly to the elite local country club to cover my father's premium golf memberships. He read the transactions flagged from luxury retail boutiques corresponding perfectly with my mother's collection of designer handbags. And then Thomas read the largest transfers. He documented the massive lump sums wired to a national commercial lending company, the exact company holding the underwater mortgage on Greg and Ashley's sprawling suburban mansion. "You used a dying man's medical fund as a personal piggy bank," Thomas stated, his voice vibrating with barely contained disgust. "Over a period of 3 years, you completely drained $200,000 from his care fund. You did not buy him oxygen. You did not hire a night nurse. You left your youngest daughter, Clara, to scrub his floors and drain her own meager savings to buy his heart medication while you subsidized your luxury lifestyle." Susan let out a shrill, desperate laugh, trying to dismiss the gravity of the accusations. "This is an outrageous mischaracterization," she cried out, waving her hand dismissively. "Henry wanted us to maintain our social standing. He verbally told us to use that money. It was a gift. He was a generous man, and he wanted his family to look successful." Richard immediately latched onto his wife's excuse, sitting up straighter and puffing out his chest. Exactly, my father said, his voice regaining a fraction of its former arrogance. I was his legal power of attorney. I had absolute discretion over those accounts. A power of attorney gives me the right to distribute assets as I see fit. My father gifted us that money to help Greg's real estate business and to keep the family afloat. You cannot retroactively punish me for accepting a family gift just because you do not like how I spent it. I sat in my corner chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my blood boiling. I remembered standing at the pharmacy counter, humiliated and terrified because my checking account had exactly $12 left in it. I remembered eating instant oatmeal for dinner so I could afford the copay for grandfather's pain medication. They were sitting in a corporate law office wearing clothes paid for by his suffering and aggressively defending their right to steal from him. Thomas Davis looked at my father with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. Richard, your fundamental misunderstanding of the law is truly staggering, he said softly. A power of attorney is a fiduciary responsibility. It explicitly prohibits you from enriching yourself at the expense of the principal. But we do not even need to debate fiduciary law today, because the $200,000 you took was not a gift. It absolutely was a gift, Richard insisted, slamming his hand onto the mahogany table. It was a loan, Thomas corrected, his voice booming across the room, silencing my father instantly. A formal, binding, high-interest commercial loan. And you signed a document confirming that exact fact. My mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Greg physically recoiled in his chair, pulling away from my father, as if Richard were suddenly contagious. I did not sign anything like that, my father yelled, his face turning a dark, angry red. You are lying. You are fabricating documents to ruin me. Thomas calmly turned a page in his grey folder. 6 months ago, Richard, you came into this office in a massive rush. Do you remember that day? You told my secretary you only had 5 minutes because you had a very important tea time at the country club. You demanded that I provide the updated release forms so you could authorize another large withdrawal from the medical trust to pay for your kitchen renovations. My father stared at the lawyer, his angry expression faltering as the memory clearly resurfaced in his mind. I handed you a stack of papers. Thomas continued, his words methodical and devastating. I told you to review them carefully. But you did not read a single word, did you, Richard? You assumed you were the smartest man in the room? You assumed I was just a glorified rubber stamp for your endless greed. You flipped to the signature pages and you signed exactly where the sticky flags told you to sign. Thomas pulled a heavily stapled legal document from the folder and slid it across the smooth wooden table directly in front of my father. You did not sign a withdrawal release, Thomas explained, watching my father stare at the paperwork in absolute horror. You signed a legally binding promissory note. This document explicitly acknowledges that every single dollar you removed from the Henry Mitchell Medical Care Trust over the past 3 years was an advance on a commercial loan. It outlines a strict repayment schedule. It includes a highly aggressive penalty interest rate for late payments. Richard picked up the document with trembling hands. His eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon, landing on his own bold signature at the bottom of the final page. You tricked me, he whispered, his voice cracking. This is entrapment. No judge will ever uphold this. You signed it freely in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary public, Thomas countered smoothly. It is ironclad. But the promissory note is actually the least of your concerns right now. Susan grabbed her husband's arm, her manicured fingernails digging deep into the fabric of his suit jacket. What else is there? She demanded, her voice shrill with raw panic. What else did you make him sign? Thomas leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You cannot secure a $200,000 loan without collateral, Susan. Henry insisted on protecting the estate. So tucked right behind that promissory note was a secondary document, a deed of trust. The air in the room seemed to turn to solid ice. Greg closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy groan. Even he understood the catastrophic implications of those words. You authorized a secondary mortgage on your primary residence, Thomas stated, delivering the final crushing blow. You used your sprawling 5-bedroom house in the country club subdivision as the sole collateral for the $200,000 debt you owe to this estate. Your home is now legally encumbered by the money you stole. The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the far wall. The absolute magnitude of their disaster was finally settling over them. They had not just lost an inheritance, they had actively handed over the keys to their own kingdom. The wealthy elite lifestyle they had sacrificed their own souls to maintain was completely compromised. "But who collects the debt?" Ashley asked, her voice trembling violently. "Grandpa is gone. The trust is dissolved. Does the money just go back to the bank?" Attorney Thomas Davis turned his head slowly away from my ruined parents and looked directly at me. He offered me the floor, shifting the immense power of the room entirely into my hands. I stood up from my chair in the corner. I did not rush. I walked slowly and deliberately to the edge of the mahogany table, taking my rightful place. "The estate does not vanish, Ashley," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly calm and level. "All assets, all properties, and all outstanding debts owed to the estate are transferred directly to the designated beneficiary." My mother looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The realization hit her like a physical strike. As the sole executor and the sole heir of Henry Mitchell's entire estate, I continued looking down at the people who had treated me like dirt for over 3 decades. "I am now holding the promissory note. I am the legal owner of your secondary mortgage. I am your direct creditor." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in the air, waiting for gravity to pull him down. Susan began to cry ugly, heaving sobs that ruined her expensive makeup. They were completely and entirely at my mercy. The daughter they had mocked, ignored, and financially abandoned was now the absolute master of their fate. I placed my hands flat on the polished table, leaning in slightly to ensure they heard every single word of my next sentence. "I spent 4 months begging you for help," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unyielding tone. "I scrubbed his floors. I managed his oxygen. I drained every single dollar from my savings account to buy the medicine he needed to survive, while you drank champagne on a yacht and posted photos about family first. You threw me to the wolves because you thought I was too weak to ever fight back." "Clara, please," my father whispered, his voice breaking completely. "We did not know. We made a mistake. You are our daughter. You cannot do this to your own family." I stood up straight, looking down at him with absolute cold authority. "You have exactly 30 days to repay the $200,000 you stole from a dying man," I stated, delivering my final ultimatum. "If the full balance, including all accrued interest and penalties, is not deposited into the estate account by 5 o'clock on the 30th day, I will initiate immediate legal foreclosure on your home. I will take your house, I will evict you, and I will sell it to recover the debt." The conference room descended into a state of pure chaotic devastation. Susan wailed loudly, burying her face in her hands. Richard slumped forward, resting his head on the cold mahogany table, utterly defeated. Ashley was crying, demanding that Greg do something to fix it. But Greg just stared out the glass windows, realizing his own financial bailout was officially dead. I did not stay to watch them mourn the death of their precious social status. I turned around and walked out of the conference room, leaving the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind me. I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the lobby. As the car descended toward the street level, I let out a long, shaky breath. The heavy, crushing weight I had carried on my shoulders my entire life was completely gone. The storm was finally over. The absolute silence that followed my ultimatum was heavy enough to crush bone. My father was staring at his own trembling hands, while my mother quietly sobbed into a crumpled tissue. They had just realized they were entirely at my mercy, and the weight of their stolen debt was suffocating them. But my brother-in-law, Greg, was a completely different kind of animal. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life bullying his way out of consequences. He had survived in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate by being the loudest and most aggressive person in any room. He simply could not accept that a hospital billing clerk had just legally cornered him. The shock on his face rapidly contorted into a violent defensive rage. Greg pushed himself away from the polished mahogany table so hard that his heavy executive chair slammed into the glass wall behind him. The loud crack made my sister Ashley jump in her seat. "You think you are so smart, Clara?" He spat, his voice echoing through the corporate suite with an ugly, aggressive resonance. "You think you can just walk in here with some dusty old documents and hold this family hostage? You are completely delusional. Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? I have an entire floor of corporate litigators on retainer. Men who charge $800 an hour just to read an email." He took two large, intimidating steps toward the corner where I was sitting. Attorney Thomas Davis shifted slightly in his seat, ready to intervene, but I held up a single hand to stop him. I did not need protection. I wanted Greg to speak. I wanted him to exhaust every single drop of his fake arrogance. "We are not paying you a single dime," Greg shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "We will tie this entire estate up in probate court for the next decade. I will file injunction after injunction. I will freeze every bank account, every property deed, and every liquid asset your grandfather left behind. I will bury you in so much legal paperwork you will spend the rest of your pathetic life paying attorney fees. You will be begging on the streets before you ever see a single penny of this inheritance." He turned back to my parents, projecting the false confidence of a general rallying his defeated troops. "Richard, Susan, do not let this little administrative assistant intimidate you. She is playing a desperate game of bluff. My firm will handle this. We will tie her up in litigation until she is forced to settle for pennies. I guarantee you she does not have the stamina or the financial backing to fight a real war." Ashley immediately latched onto her husband's toxic bravado. Her tear-streaked face suddenly twisted into a cruel, familiar sneer. She crossed her arms and looked at me with pure venom. "You are going to ruin yourself, Clara. Greg knows exactly how to destroy people in court. You should have just kept your mouth shut and stayed out of adult business. You always ruin everything." I remained perfectly seated in my chair. My posture was completely relaxed. My hands rested comfortably in my lap. I watched the golden child and her wealthy husband try to reassert their dominance over a situation they fundamentally did not understand. They were threatening me with a corporate war, but they did not realize the war was already over. The final shot had already been fired, and they were just waiting for the impact. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a happy smile. It was the cold, calculated expression of someone who held the absolute winning hand. I looked up at Greg. The sheer calmness of my expression made his ranting falter. The vein pulsing in his forehead seemed to throb faster as he stared down at me. "You are right about one thing, Greg," I said, my voice soft and conversational. "I am just a hospital clerk. I do not have a floor of expensive corporate litigators on retainer. I do not have the resources to fight a 10-year legal battle in probate court. I completely agree with your assessment." Greg smirked, crossing his thick arms over his tailored chest. "Then you need to drop this ridiculous charade right now and hand over the deeds. Be a good girl and walk away before things get incredibly ugly for you." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on my knees. "Things are not going to get ugly for me, Greg, because we are never going to court. You see, while you rely on intimidation and expensive lawyers, I rely on basic research. I process complex medical claims all day long. My entire job revolves around finding discrepancies, locating hidden information, and understanding exactly who is financially responsible. I am exceptionally good at gathering data." Greg frowned, his arrogant smirk slipping just a fraction. "What are you talking about?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the photo gallery, holding the device up so he could clearly see the image displayed. It was the photograph Ashley had posted on social media the morning of grandfather's funeral. The picture of all four of them holding martini glasses on the deck of a luxury yacht. "Your little social media victory lap was very informative," I explained, keeping my eyes locked firmly on his face. Ashley used the hashtag #FamilyFirst, which was incredibly poor taste considering she was skipping a burial, but she also tagged the location. She wanted all of her country club friends to know exactly whose boat she was standing on. She tagged the Silver Sovereign. My sister shifted uncomfortably in her chair, suddenly realizing she had somehow caused a major problem. She looked at her husband with wide, nervous eyes. "The Silver Sovereign is a beautiful vessel." I continued, my tone remaining perfectly polite and deeply lethal. "It is registered to a holding company owned by a man named William Carlson. Now, I know the name William Carlson because he's the primary managing partner of the commercial development firm you work for. He's your big boss. He's the man you have been desperately trying to impress for the last 2 years, so he will finally promote you to senior director." Greg's face went completely blank. The aggressive red color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly pale pallor. He lowered his arms, his hands dropping limply to his sides. "Why are you looking at my boss?" he demanded, his voice losing all of its booming authority. I set my phone down on the small table next to my chair. Because Mr. Carlson has a very specific reputation in the commercial real estate world. He is famously obsessed with integrity. He serves on the ethics board of the State Commerce Committee. He absolutely despises public scandals, and he legally refuses to partner with anyone who carries hidden liabilities. He runs a tight, clean ship. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the sheer terror to slowly bloom in my brother-in-law's chest. So this morning, while all of you were still sleeping off your expensive hangovers from the yacht party, I woke up very early. I told the room. I put on my best suit. And I drove to an upscale diner in the financial district to have a 7 o'clock breakfast meeting with William Carlson. Greg let out a sharp, strangled gasp. It sounded like he had been physically struck in the stomach. He took a heavy, stumbling step backward, bumping into the mahogany conference table. "You are lying," he choked out, shaking his head frantically. "You could never get a meeting with William Carlson. He does not take meetings with random nobodies. He takes meetings when someone emails his private assistant directly and provides undeniable photographic proof of active financial embezzlement committed by one of his own executives." I corrected smoothly. He was incredibly eager to meet with me. Ashley stood up, her voice cracking with high-pitched panic. "Greg, what is she talking about? What embezzlement?" I looked at my sister, allowing a moment of pure pity to wash over me. She really had no idea. She was married to a man who had built their entire life on a foundation of sand and stolen money. I handed Mr. Carlson a very thick, very detailed manila folder over scrambled eggs and black coffee. "This morning," I said, turning my attention back to Greg, "I gave him the bank statements proving that you and my parents drained a dying man's medical trust fund to zero. I showed him the forged signatures. I showed him the secondary mortgage documents proving that your sprawling suburban mansion is completely underwater and heavily leveraged against stolen money. I provided the exact paper trail showing that you are entirely broke. You are drowning in hidden debts, and you are using stolen funds from an elderly man to maintain a fake lifestyle." Greg was visibly trembling now. Sweat beaded on his forehead, shining under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. He opened his mouth, but he could not force any words past his lips. He looked utterly, thoroughly destroyed. My father Richard finally broke his silence. He gripped the edge of the table, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "You went to his boss. You showed a stranger our private financial records. Clara, how could you do that? You just destroyed his entire career." "I did not destroy his career, Dad," I replied coldly. "His own greed destroyed his career. I just provided the documentation." Mr. Carlson was profoundly disturbed by what he read. He explained to me that his firm is currently undergoing a massive federal audit for a new commercial contract. Having an executive who's actively engaging in elder financial abuse and hiding massive personal debts is a catastrophic liability for his company. I picked up my cell phone from the side table. I unlocked the screen and navigated to my contacts list. Mr. Carlson asked me to give him a call when this will reading was concluded. I explained, tapping the screen a few times. He specifically requested to be placed on speakerphone so he could deliver a message directly to you, Greg. "No," Greg whispered, taking another step backward. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. "Clara, please do not do this. Please, you do not understand. If he fires me, we lose everything. We will lose the cars, the house, the club memberships. We will have absolutely nothing. You already have nothing, Greg." I said, my voice devoid of any mercy. "You have been living on stolen time and stolen money. The bill is simply due today." I pressed the call button and hit the speaker icon. The phone rang loudly, echoing off the glass walls of the quiet conference room. It rang once. It rang twice. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. My mother was clutching her pearl necklace, staring at the phone like it was an explosive device. Ashley was weeping quietly, realizing that her golden child status was about to be permanently revoked. On the third ring, the call connected. A deep, authoritative voice filled the room. "Clara," the voice said. "Is it done?" "Yes, Mr. Carlson," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly professional. "The will reading is concluded. Greg is here in the room with me. You are on speakerphone." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. When William Carlson finally spoke, his voice was completely stripped of any human warmth. It was the cold, calculated sound of a corporate executioner removing a diseased limb from his company. Gregory, he said the name, dripping with absolute disdain. I spent the last 3 hours verifying the financial documents Clara provided to me this morning. My accounting team reviewed your personal disclosures from last quarter. You lied on your background checks. You actively concealed massive underwater mortgages, and you utilized stolen funds from a vulnerable elderly man to artificially inflate your liquid asset reports to this firm. Greg squeezed his eyes shut, tears of profound humiliation leaking down his red face. "Sir, please let me explain," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "It was a temporary family loan. I was going to pay it back. I just needed to secure the capital for the downtown project. Please, I have a family. I need this job." "You do not have a job." William Carlson interrupted, his voice snapping like a whip. "You are a massive liability to my firm and to my personal reputation. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Security has already packed your desk into boxes. Do not attempt to enter the building. If you set foot on company property, you will be arrested for trespassing." Ashley let out a loud, agonizing scream. She dropped her expensive designer tote bag onto the floor, falling to her knees. "Greg, you promised me we were fine," she sobbed, hitting his leg with her fists. "You promised me we had the money. How are we going to pay for anything?" William Carlson was not finished. "Furthermore, Gregory, my legal team, is officially forwarding the entire dossier of your financial crimes to the State Commercial Real Estate Licensing Board. They will be launching a full investigation into your ethical conduct. I highly doubt you will ever hold a real estate license in this state again. We are completely done here." The line went dead with a sharp final click. The silence that rushed back into the conference room was deafening. The social and financial empire my family had desperately tried to build on my back had been completely decimated in less than 10 minutes. The grand illusion was entirely shattered. Greg collapsed into the nearest chair, putting his head between his knees and sobbing uncontrollably. He was ruined. His career was gone. His license was about to be revoked. His massive suburban mansion was heavily mortgaged, and I held the primary debt. He was a complete, total failure. Ashley remained on the floor, weeping hysterically, her perfect makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her face. The golden child who had spent her entire life mocking my modest apartment and my hourly wages was now officially married to an unemployed, disgraced fraud. My parents sat frozen at the mahogany table, staring at the wreckage of their favorite daughter and her husband. Richard looked incredibly old, his shoulders hunched forward in absolute defeat. Susan was staring blankly at the wall, her hands shaking violently. They had gambled everything on Greg's success. They had stolen from their own dying father to keep Greg afloat. And now every single thing they had sacrificed their morality for was completely gone. Attorney Thomas Davis calmly organized his paperwork, closing the thick leather binder. He looked at me across the room, his eyes reflecting a deep, quiet respect. I picked up my leather tote bag and placed my cell phone inside. I stood up from my chair, feeling lighter than I had felt in over 30 years. I did not look back at the crying, miserable people in the conference room. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. I walked toward the heavy frosted glass doors, ready. The absolute silence that followed my ultimatum was heavy enough to crush bone. My father was staring at his own trembling hands, while my mother quietly sobbed into a crumpled tissue. They had just realized they were entirely at my mercy, and the weight of their stolen debt was suffocating them. But my brother-in-law Greg was a completely different kind of animal. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life bullying his way out of consequences. He had survived in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate by being the loudest and most aggressive person in any room. He simply could not accept that a hospital billing clerk had just legally cornered him. The shock on his face rapidly contorted into a violent defensive rage. Greg pushed himself away from the polished mahogany table so hard that his heavy executive chair slammed into the glass wall behind him. The loud crack made my sister Ashley jump in her seat. "You think you are so smart, Clara?" he spat, his voice echoing through the corporate suite with an ugly, aggressive resonance. "You think you can just walk in here with some dusty old documents and hold this family hostage? You are completely delusional. Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? I have an entire floor of corporate litigators on retainer, men who charge $800 an hour just to read an email." He took 2 large, intimidating steps toward the corner where I was sitting. Attorney Thomas Davis shifted slightly in his seat, ready to intervene, but I held up a single hand to stop him. I did not need protection. I wanted Greg to speak. I wanted him to exhaust every single drop of his fake arrogance. "We are not paying you a single dime," Greg shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "We will tie this entire estate up in probate court for the next decade. I will file injunction after injunction. I will freeze every bank account, every property deed, and every liquid asset your grandfather left behind. I will bury you in so much legal paperwork, you will spend the rest of your pathetic life paying attorney fees. You will be begging on the streets before you ever see a single penny of this inheritance." He turned back to my parents, projecting the false confidence of a general rallying his defeated troops. "Richard, Susan, do not let this little administrative assistant intimidate you. She's playing a desperate game of bluff. My firm will handle this. We will tie her up in litigation until she is forced to settle for pennies. I guarantee you she does not have the stamina or the financial backing to fight a real war." Ashley immediately latched onto her husband's toxic bravado. Her tear-streaked face suddenly twisted into a cruel, familiar sneer. She crossed her arms and looked at me with pure venom. "You are going to ruin yourself, Clara. Greg knows exactly how to destroy people in court. You should have just kept your mouth shut and stayed out of adult business. You always ruin everything." I remained perfectly seated in my chair. My posture was completely relaxed. My hands rested comfortably in my lap. I watched the golden child and her wealthy husband try to reassert their dominance over a situation they fundamentally did not understand. They were threatening me with a corporate war, but they did not realize the war was already over. The final shot had already been fired, and they were just waiting for the impact. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a happy smile. It was the cold, calculated expression of someone who held the absolute winning hand. I looked up at Greg. The sheer calmness of my expression made his ranting falter. The vein pulsing in his forehead seemed to throb faster as he stared down at me. "You are right about one thing, Greg," I said, my voice soft and conversational. "I am just a hospital clerk. I do not have a floor of expensive corporate litigators on retainer. I do not have the resources to fight a 10-year legal battle in probate court. I completely agree with your assessment." Greg smirked, crossing his thick arms over his tailored chest. "Then you need to drop this ridiculous charade right now and hand over the deeds. Be a good girl and walk away before things get incredibly ugly for you." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on my knees. "Things are not going to get ugly for me, Greg, because we are never going to court. You see, while you rely on intimidation and expensive lawyers, I rely on basic research. I process complex medical claims all day long. My entire job revolves around finding discrepancies, locating hidden information, and understanding exactly who is financially responsible. I am exceptionally good at gathering data." Greg frowned, his arrogant smirk slipping just a fraction. "What are you talking about?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the photo gallery, holding the device up so he could clearly see the image displayed. It was the photograph Ashley had posted on social media the morning of grandfather's funeral. The picture of all four of them holding martini glasses on the deck of a luxury yacht. "Your little social media victory lap was very informative," I explained, keeping my eyes locked firmly on his face. Ashley used the hashtag #FamilyFirst, which was incredibly poor taste considering she was skipping a burial, but she also tagged the location. She wanted all of her country club friends to know exactly whose boat she was standing on. She tagged the Silver Sovereign, or Sir. My sister shifted uncomfortably in her chair, suddenly realizing she had somehow caused a major problem. She looked at her husband with wide, nervous eyes. "The Silver Sovereign is a beautiful vessel." I continued my tone, remaining perfectly polite and deeply lethal. "It is registered to a holding company owned by a man named William Carlson. Now I know the name William Carlson because he's the primary managing partner of the commercial development firm you work for. He's your big boss. He's the man you have been desperately trying to impress for the last 2 years, so he will finally promote you to senior director." Greg's face went completely blank. The aggressive red color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly pale pallor. He lowered his arms, his hands dropping limply to his sides. "Why are you looking up my boss?" he demanded, his voice losing all of its booming authority. I set my phone down on the small table next to my chair. "Because Mr. Carlson has a very specific reputation in the commercial real estate world. He is famously obsessed with integrity. He serves on the ethics board of the State Commerce Committee. He absolutely despises public scandals, and he legally refuses to partner with anyone who carries hidden liabilities. He runs a tight, clean ship. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the sheer terror to slowly bloom in my brother-in-law's chest. So this morning, while all of you were still sleeping off your expensive hangovers from the yacht party, I woke up very early. I told the room, I put on my best suit, and I drove to an upscale diner in the financial district to have a 7 o'clock breakfast meeting with William Carlson. Greg let out a sharp, strangled gasp. It sounded like he had been physically struck in the stomach. He took a heavy, stumbling step backward, bumping into the mahogany conference table. "You are lying," he choked out, shaking his head frantically. "You could never get a meeting with William Carlson. He does not take meetings with random nobodies. He takes meetings when someone emails his private assistant directly and provides undeniable photographic proof of active financial embezzlement committed by one of his own executives." I corrected smoothly. He was incredibly eager to meet with me. Ashley stood up, her voice cracking with high-pitched panic. "Greg, what is she talking about? What embezzlement?" I looked at my sister, allowing a moment of pure pity to wash over me. She really had no idea. She was married to a man who had built their entire life on a foundation of sand and stolen money. I handed Mr. Carlson a very thick, very detailed manila folder over scrambled eggs and black coffee. "This morning," I said, turning my attention back to Greg, "I gave him the bank statements proving that you and my parents drained a dying man's medical trust fund to zero. I showed him the forged signatures. I showed him the secondary mortgage documents proving that your sprawling suburban mansion is completely underwater and heavily leveraged against stolen money. I provided the exact paper trail showing that you are entirely broke. You are drowning in hidden debts, and you are using stolen funds from an elderly man to maintain a fake lifestyle." Greg was visibly trembling now. Sweat beaded on his forehead, shining under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. He opened his mouth, but he could not force any words past his lips. He looked utterly, thoroughly destroyed. My father, Richard, finally broke his silence. He gripped the edge of the table, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "You went to his boss. You showed a stranger our private financial records. Clara, how could you do that? You just destroyed his entire career." "I did not destroy his career, Dad," I replied coldly. "His own greed destroyed his career. I just provided the documentation." Mr. Carlson was profoundly disturbed by what he read. He explained to me that his firm is currently undergoing a massive federal audit for a new commercial contract. Having an executive who's actively engaging in elder financial abuse and hiding massive personal debts is a catastrophic liability for his company. I picked up my cell phone from the side table. I unlocked the screen and navigated to my contacts list. Mr. Carlson asked me to give him a call. When this reading was concluded, I explained, tapping the screen a few times. He specifically requested to be placed on speakerphone so he could deliver a message directly to you, Greg. "No," Greg whispered, taking another step backward. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. "Clara, please do not do this. Please. You do not understand. If he fires me, we lose everything. We will lose the cars, the house, the club memberships. We will have absolutely nothing. You already have nothing, Greg." I said, my voice devoid of any mercy. "You have been living on stolen time and stolen money. The bill is simply due today." I pressed the call button and hit the speaker icon. The phone rang loudly, echoing off the glass walls of the quiet conference room. It rang once. It rang twice. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. My mother was clutching her pearl necklace, staring at the phone like it was an explosive device. Ashley was weeping quietly, realizing that her golden child status was about to be permanently revoked. On the third ring, the call connected. A deep, authoritative voice filled the room. "Clara," the voice said. "Is it done?" "Yes, Mr. Carlson," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly professional. "The will reading is concluded. Greg is here in the room with me. You're on speakerphone." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. When William Carlson finally spoke, his voice was completely stripped of any human warmth. It was the cold, calculated sound of a corporate executioner removing a diseased limb from his company. "Gregory," he said, the name dripping with absolute disdain. I spent the last 3 hours verifying the financial documents Clara provided to me this morning. My accounting team reviewed your personal disclosures from last quarter. You lied on your background checks. You actively concealed massive underwater mortgages. And you utilized stolen funds from a vulnerable elderly man to artificially inflate your liquid asset reports to this firm. Greg squeezed his eyes shut, tears of profound humiliation leaking down his red face. Sir, please let me explain. He begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. It was a temporary family loan. I was going to pay it back. I just needed to secure the capital for the downtown project. Please, sir, I have a family. I need this job. You do not have a job. William Carlson interrupted, his voice snapping like a whip. You are a massive liability to my firm and to my personal reputation. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Security has already packed your desk into boxes. Do not attempt to enter the building. If you set foot on company property, you will be arrested for trespassing. Ashley let out a loud, agonizing scream. She dropped her expensive designer tote bag onto the floor, falling to her knees. Greg, you promised me we were fine? She sobbed, hitting his leg with her fists. You promised me we had the money. How are we going to pay for anything? William Carlson was not finished. Furthermore, Gregory, my legal team, is officially forwarding the entire dossier of your financial crimes to the State Commercial Real Estate Licensing Board. They will be launching a full investigation into your ethical conduct. I highly doubt you will ever hold a real estate license in this state again. We are completely done here. The line went dead with a sharp final click. The silence that rushed back into the conference room was deafening. The social and financial empire my family had desperately tried to build on my back had been completely decimated in less than 10 minutes. The grand illusion was entirely shattered. Greg collapsed into the nearest chair, putting his head between his knees and sobbing uncontrollably. He was ruined, his career was gone, his license was about to be revoked, his massive suburban mansion was heavily mortgaged, and I held the primary debt. He was a complete total failure. Ashley remained on the floor, weeping hysterically, her perfect makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her face. The golden child who had spent her entire life mocking my modest apartment and my hourly wages was now officially married to an unemployed, disgraced fraud. My parents sat frozen at the mahogany table, staring at the wreckage of their favorite daughter and her husband. Richard looked incredibly old, his shoulders hunched forward in absolute defeat. Susan was staring blankly at the wall, her hands shaking violently. They had gambled everything on Greg's success. They had stolen from their own dying father to keep Greg afloat. And now every single thing they had sacrificed their morality for was completely gone. Attorney Thomas Davis calmly organized his paperwork, closing the thick leather binder. He looked at me across the room, his eyes reflecting a deep, quiet respect. I picked up my leather tote bag and placed my cell phone inside. I stood up from my chair feeling lighter than I had felt in over 30 years. I did not look back at the crying, miserable people in the conference room. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. I walked toward the heavy frosted glass doors, ready. The absolute silence that followed my ultimatum was heavy enough to crush bone. My father was staring at his own trembling hands, while my mother quietly sobbed into a crumpled tissue. They had just realized they were entirely at my mercy, and the weight of their stolen debt was suffocating them. But my brother-in-law, Greg, was a completely different kind of animal. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life bullying his way out of consequences. He had survived in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate by being the loudest and most aggressive person in any room. He simply could not accept that a hospital billing clerk had just legally cornered him. The shock on his face rapidly contorted into a violent defensive rage. Greg pushed himself away from the polished mahogany table so hard that his heavy executive chair slammed into the glass wall behind him. The loud crack made my sister Ashley jump in her seat. "You think you're so smart, Clara?" He spat, his voice echoing through the corporate suite with an ugly, aggressive resonance. "You think you can just walk in here with some dusty old documents and hold this family hostage? You are completely delusional. Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? I have an entire floor of corporate litigators on retainer. Men who charge $800 an hour just to read an email." He took 2 large, intimidating steps toward the corner where I was sitting. Attorney Thomas Davis shifted slightly in his seat, ready to intervene, but I held up a single hand to stop him. I did not need protection. I wanted Greg to speak. I wanted him to exhaust every single drop of his fake arrogance. "We are not paying you a single dime," Greg shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "We will tie this entire estate up in probate court for the next decade. I will file injunction after injunction. I will freeze every bank account, every property deed, and every liquid asset your grandfather left behind. I will bury you in so much legal paperwork you will spend the rest of your pathetic life paying attorney fees. You will be begging on the streets before you ever see a single penny of this inheritance." He turned back to my parents, projecting the false confidence of a general rallying his defeated troops. "Richard, Susan, do not let this little administrative assistant intimidate you. She's playing a desperate game of bluff. My firm will handle this. We will tie her up in litigation until she's forced to settle for pennies. I guarantee you she does not have the stamina or the financial backing to fight a real war." Ashley immediately latched onto her husband's toxic bravado. Her tear-streaked face suddenly twisted into a cruel, familiar sneer. She crossed her arms and looked at me with pure venom. "You're going to ruin yourself, Clara. Greg knows exactly how to destroy people in court. You should have just kept your mouth shut and stayed out of adult business. You always ruin everything." I remained perfectly seated in my chair. My posture was completely relaxed. My hands rested comfortably in my lap. I watched the golden child and her wealthy husband try to reassert their dominance over a situation they fundamentally did not understand. They were threatening me with a corporate war, but they did not realize the war was already over. The final shot had already been fired, and they were just waiting for the impact. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a happy smile. It was the cold, calculated expression of someone who held the absolute winning hand. I looked up at Greg. The sheer calmness of my expression made his ranting falter. The vein pulsing in his forehead seemed to throb faster as he stared down at me. "You are right about one thing, Greg," I said, my voice soft and conversational. "I am just a hospital clerk. I do not have a floor of expensive corporate litigators on retainer. I do not have the resources to fight a 10-year legal battle in probate court." "I completely agree with your assessment." Greg smirked, crossing his thick arms over his tailored chest. "Then you need to drop this ridiculous charade right now and hand over the deeds. Be a good girl and walk away before things get incredibly ugly for you." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on my knees. "Things are not going to get ugly for me, Greg, because we are never going to court. You see, while you rely on intimidation and expensive lawyers, I rely on basic research. I process complex medical claims all day long. My entire job revolves around finding discrepancies, locating hidden information, and understanding exactly who is financially responsible. I am exceptionally good at gathering data." Greg frowned, his arrogant smirk slipping just a fraction. "What are you talking about?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the photo gallery, holding the device up so he could clearly see the image displayed. It was the photograph Ashley had posted on social media the morning of grandfather's funeral. The picture of all four of them holding martini glasses on the deck of a luxury yacht. "Your little social media victory lap was very informative," I explained, keeping my eyes locked firmly on his face. Ashley used the hashtag #FamilyFirst, which was incredibly poor taste, considering she was skipping a burial. But she also tagged the location. She wanted all of her country club friends to know exactly whose boat she was standing on. She tagged the Silver Sovereign. Silver Soul. My sister shifted uncomfortably in her chair, suddenly realizing she had somehow caused a major problem. She looked at her husband with wide, nervous eyes. "The Silver Sovereign is a beautiful vessel." I continued my tone, remaining perfectly polite and deeply lethal. "It is registered to a holding company owned by a man named William Carlson. Now, I know the name William Carlson because he's the primary managing partner of the commercial development firm you work for. He's your big boss. He's the man you have been desperately trying to impress for the last 2 years, so he will finally promote you to senior director." Greg's face went completely blank. The aggressive red color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly pale pallor. He lowered his arms, his hands dropping limply to his sides. "Why are you looking at my boss?" he demanded, his voice losing all of its booming authority. I set my phone down on the small table next to my chair. "Because Mr. Carlson has a very specific reputation in the commercial real estate world. He is famously obsessed with integrity. He serves on the ethics board of the State Commerce Committee. He absolutely despises public scandals, and he legally refuses to partner with anyone who carries hidden liabilities. He runs a tight, clean ship. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the sheer terror to slowly bloom in my brother-in-law's chest. So this morning, while all of you were still sleeping off your expensive hangovers from the yacht party, I woke up very early. I told the room. I put on my best suit, and I drove to an upscale diner in the financial district to have a 7 o'clock breakfast meeting with William Carlson. Greg let out a sharp, strangled gasp. It sounded like he had been physically struck in the stomach. He took a heavy, stumbling step backward, bumping into the mahogany conference table. "You are lying," he choked out, shaking his head frantically. "You could never get a meeting with William Carlson. He does not take meetings with random nobodies. He takes meetings when someone emails his private assistant directly and provides undeniable photographic proof of active financial embezzlement committed by one of his own executives." I corrected smoothly. He was incredibly eager to meet with me. Ashley stood up, her voice cracking with high-pitched panic. "Greg, what is she talking about? What embezzlement?" I looked at my sister, allowing a moment of pure pity to wash over me. She really had no idea. She was married to a man who had built their entire life on a foundation of sand and stolen money. I handed Mr. Carlson a very thick, very detailed manila folder over scrambled eggs and black coffee. "This morning," I said, turning my attention back to Greg. "I gave him the bank statements proving that you and my parents drained a dying man's medical trust fund to zero. I showed him the forged signatures. I showed him the secondary mortgage documents proving that your sprawling suburban mansion is completely underwater and heavily leveraged against stolen money. I provided the exact paper trail showing that you are entirely broke. You are drowning in hidden debts and you are using stolen funds from an elderly man to maintain a fake lifestyle." Greg was visibly trembling now. Sweat beaded on his forehead, shining under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. He opened his mouth, but he could not force any words past his lips. He looked utterly, thoroughly destroyed. My father, Richard, finally broke his silence. He gripped the edge of the table, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "You went to his boss. You showed a stranger our private financial records. Clara, how could you do that? You just destroyed his entire career." "I did not destroy his career, Dad," I replied coldly. "His own greed destroyed his career. I just provided the documentation." Mr. Carlson was profoundly disturbed by what he read. He explained to me that his firm is currently undergoing a massive federal audit for a new commercial contract. Having an executive who is actively engaging in elder financial abuse and hiding massive personal debts is a catastrophic liability for his company. I picked up my cell phone from the side table. I unlocked the screen and navigated to my contacts list. Mr. Carlson asked me to give him a call. When this reading was concluded, I explained, tapping the screen a few times. He specifically requested to be placed on speakerphone so he could deliver a message directly to you, Greg. "No," Greg whispered, taking another step backward. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. "Clara, please, do not do this. Please. You do not understand. If he fires me, we lose everything. We will lose the cars, the house, the club memberships. We will have absolutely nothing." "You already have nothing, Greg," I said, my voice devoid of any mercy. "You have been living on stolen time and stolen money. The bill is simply due today." I pressed the call button and hit the speaker icon. The phone rang loudly, echoing off the glass walls of the quiet conference room. It rang once. It rang twice. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. My mother was clutching her pearl necklace, staring at the phone like it was an explosive device. Ashley was weeping quietly, realizing that her golden child status was about to be permanently revoked. On the third ring, the call connected. A deep, authoritative voice filled the room. "Clara," the voice said, "is it done?" "Yes, Mr. Carlson," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly professional. "The will reading is concluded. Greg is here in the room with me. You are on speakerphone." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. When William Carlson finally spoke, his voice was completely stripped of any human warmth. It was the cold, calculated sound of a corporate executioner removing a diseased limb from his company. "Gregory?" He said the name dripping with absolute disdain. I spent the last 3 hours verifying the financial documents Clara provided to me this morning. My accounting team reviewed your personal disclosures from last quarter. You lied on your background checks. You actively concealed massive underwater mortgages. And you utilized stolen funds from a vulnerable elderly man to artificially inflate your liquid asset reports to this firm. Greg squeezed his eyes shut, tears of profound humiliation leaking down his red face. "Sir, please, let me explain," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "It was a temporary family loan. I was going to pay it back. I just needed to secure the capital for the downtown project. Please, sir, I have a family. I need this job." "You do not have a job," William Carlson interrupted, his voice snapping like a whip. "You are a massive liability to my firm and to my personal reputation. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Security has already packed your desk into boxes. Do not attempt to enter the building. If you set foot on company property, you will be arrested for trespassing." Ashley let out a loud, agonizing scream. She dropped her expensive designer tote bag onto the floor, falling to her knees. "Greg, you promised me we were fine," she sobbed, hitting his leg with her fists. "You promised me we had the money. How are we going to pay for anything?" William Carlson was not finished. "Furthermore, Gregory, my legal team, is officially forwarding the entire dossier of your financial crimes to the State Commercial Real Estate Licensing Board. They will be launching a full investigation into your ethical conduct. I highly doubt you will ever hold a real estate license in this state again. We are completely done here." The line went dead with a sharp final click. The silence that rushed back into the conference room was deafening. The social and financial empire my family had desperately tried to build on my back had been completely decimated in less than 10 minutes. The grand illusion was entirely shattered. Greg collapsed into the nearest chair, putting his head between his knees and sobbing uncontrollably. He was ruined. His career was gone. His license was about to be revoked. His massive suburban mansion was heavily mortgaged, and I held the primary debt. He was a complete, total failure. Ashley remained on the floor, weeping hysterically, her perfect makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her face. The golden child who had spent her entire life mocking my modest apartment and my hourly wages was now officially married to an unemployed, disgraced fraud. My parents sat frozen at the mahogany table, staring at the wreckage of their favorite daughter and her husband. Richard looked incredibly old, his shoulders hunched forward in absolute defeat. Susan was staring blankly at the wall, her hands shaking violently. They had gambled everything on Greg's success. They had stolen from their own dying father to keep Greg afloat. And now every single thing they had sacrificed their morality for was completely gone. Attorney Thomas Davis calmly organized his paperwork, closing the thick leather binder. He looked at me across the room, his eyes reflecting a deep, quiet respect. I picked up my leather tote bag and placed my cell phone inside. I stood up from my chair, feeling lighter than I had felt in over 30 years. I did not look back at the crying, miserable people in the conference room. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. I walked toward the heavy frosted glass doors, ready. 3 weeks. That is exactly how long it takes for a towering monument of arrogance to crumble into dust when the foundation is pulled out from underneath it. For 21 days, I had watched the legal machinery that Grandpa Henry and Attorney Thomas Davis had so brilliantly engineered grind my family's illusion of wealth into fine powder. The foreclosure notices had been officially filed and served. The paperwork was sterile, completely devoid of emotion, wrapped in dense legal jargon. But the reality it carried was an absolute nightmare for Richard and Susan Mitchell. I was standing in my new office, a space I had recently leased, using a small portion of the liquid assets Grandpa had left me. I had already submitted my resignation at the hospital. The days of fighting over medical billing codes for an hourly wage were over. This new office was sparse, smelling of fresh paint and polished hardwood, with a massive window that overlooked the quiet, sleeping city. It was exactly 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. I had stayed late reviewing architectural plans for what I intended to do with Grandpa's commercial land. The silence of the room was a comfort, a thick blanket of peace that I had never been allowed to experience in the house I grew up in. Then my cell phone vibrated against the glass surface of my desk. The harsh buzzing sound shattered the quiet. I looked down at the bright screen. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Susan. Right beneath it, another incoming call alert popped up from my father. "Richard!" They were taking turns frantically trying to break through my silence. A month ago, seeing their names on my phone at 2 in the morning would have sent my heart into a panic. I would have answered immediately, terrified that someone was hurt, ready to sacrifice my sleep, my time, and my peace of mind to rush to their aid. I would have assumed the role of the obedient, invisible daughter, eager to fix whatever mess they had created. But tonight, my heart rate did not even tick upward. My pulse remained completely steady. I picked up the phone, swiped the green button, and lifted the device to my ear. I did not say hello, I just listened. What I heard first was not a greeting. It was the sound of raw, unadulterated hysteria. Clara, Clara, please talk to me. It was my mother. Her voice was entirely unrecognizable. The polished country club drawl she had spent decades perfecting was completely gone. In its place was jagged, breathless sobbing. I remained silent, leaning back against the edge of my desk, my eyes tracing the headlights of a single car driving down the dark street outside my window. Clara, are you there? Please tell me you are there. We are begging you. My father's voice suddenly cut in. They must have had me on speakerphone. His tone was frantic, completely stripped of the pompous authority he used to bark orders at me to make coffee and hand over keys. I am here, I said. My voice was calm, steady, and terrifyingly flat. The sound of my voice seemed to trigger a new wave of weeping from my mother. Oh, thank God. Clara, you have to stop this. You have to call your lawyer and stop this right now. The sheriffs came today. They served the papers. They are taking the house, Clara. They are actually taking our home. You mean my house? I corrected gently. The one you put up as collateral when you decided to steal a dying man's medical trust fund. We did not steal it. We borrowed it. We were going to pay him back. We are blood, Clara. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You cannot put your own parents out on the street. We will have nowhere to go. My father was practically hyperventilating, his words stumbling over each other in his desperation. I walked slowly toward the large window, feeling the cool glass radiate against my skin. They were pulling out every manipulative tactic they had ever used on me, expecting me to fold, expecting the guilt to wash over me and force me to submit. Where is the golden child? I asked, keeping my tone mild, conversational even. Why do you not move in with Ashley and Greg? They have that massive house in the gated community. I am sure they have plenty of room for you. A sharp, ugly sob ripped from my mother's throat. She sounded like she was choking. You know exactly what happened, Clara. Do not play games with us. I did know. I knew because the fallout from my phone call with Mr. Carlson had been spectacular. Greg was entirely radioactive in the commercial real estate world. Carlson had made good on his promise. He had fired Greg immediately and sent the dossier of his hidden debts, underwater mortgages, and elder financial abuse straight to the state licensing board. Greg was currently facing multiple investigations and an absolute mountain of civil lawsuits. His accounts had been frozen. He was, for all intents and purposes, entirely bankrupt. And Ashley, the sister who had mocked me as a pathetic hourly worker, had not stood by her man. The moment the money dried up and the luxury cars were repossessed, the facade of their perfect networking marriage shattered. Ashley is filing for divorce. My father said, his voice dropping into a hoarse, defeated whisper. Greg is ruined. He has absolutely nothing left, and Ashley had to move into a cheap motel because her credit cards are completely maxed out. She cannot help us, Clara. Nobody can help us but you. Our friends have stopped taking our calls. My mother cried, her words rushing out in a torrent of self-pity. We have been completely blacklisted at the club. The neighbors are looking at us like we are criminals. Please, Clara, you have to have a heart. You have proven your point. You won. Now please give us back our lives. I stood by the window looking at my own reflection in the glass. I searched my eyes for any sign of guilt, any trace of the obedient daughter who used to shrink herself to fit into the tiny, miserable box they had built for me. I felt nothing but an unshakable, brilliant peace. It was the absolute clarity of someone who had survived a long, dark storm and finally stepped out into the sunlight. Have a heart, I repeated, letting the words roll around in the quiet office. You want me to have a heart? Yes, please, baby. We are so sorry. We are so sorry. My mother grasped at the opening, mistaking my calm repetition for a softening of my resolve. I looked out at the city skyline. I remembered the heavy oak door of Grandpa Henry's house. I remembered the smell of the hospital room where I spent night after night wiping his brow, listening to him breathe while they were out buying designer dresses and boasting about their future. I remembered the crippling anxiety of looking at my bank account, wondering how I was going to buy groceries after draining my savings to pay for Grandpa's out-of-pocket medications. But most of all, I remembered the rain. I remember the rain, I said softly. What are you talking about? My father sounded confused, his panic hitching in his throat. It was pouring rain on the day of the funeral. I spoke clearly, enunciating every single syllable so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. The water was soaking right through my coat. I stood by his grave shivering, holding a $9,000 invoice that I paid with my own money. I was the only family member there. Just me, the pastor, and Thomas. Clara, we told you the traffic was terrible. We could not make it. My mother tried to interject, still clinging to the lies that had defined her entire existence. I cut her off. My voice did not rise in volume, but it dropped in temperature, turning cold and sharp enough to cut glass. I called you. I called you to beg you to come say goodbye to your own father, and you told me you were too busy toasting to your future. You told me to stop being dramatic. Silence fell over the line, a heavy, suffocating silence. The realization of what I was saying was finally beginning to penetrate their panic. You were standing on a yacht holding martinis, smiling brightly for the camera. You were toasting to the multi-million-dollar inheritance you thought you were going to build your empire on. You traded your father's funeral for a networking party, and you traded my future to pay for your country club dues. We made a mistake. My father wept. He was actually weeping, this proud, arrogant man who had barked orders at me his entire life. Please, Clara, we are begging you. I pressed my hand against the cold window pane. Well, your future is here, I said, and it is exactly what you earned. Clara, no, do not do this, please. My mother screamed a primal sound of absolute terror. Do not ever contact me again. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not wait to hear their response. I did not want to hear another word from them for the rest of my natural life. I pressed the red button and watched the call disconnect. The screen went dark. Immediately, I opened my phone settings. I selected Susan Mitchell. Block this caller, confirm. I selected Richard Mitchell. Block this caller, confirm. I went into my recent calls and found Ashley's number, which she had used to harass me 2 weeks prior. Block this caller, confirm. I set the phone face down on the desk. The silence returned to the office, but it was not the heavy, oppressive silence of the past. It was light. It was breathable. It was the sound of absolute freedom. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the quiet air of my new life, and for the first time in 31 years, I smiled a genuine, fearless smile. The debt was paid. The ties were severed. I was finally truly free. The 30-day deadline I had given my parents expired quietly on a Tuesday afternoon. There was no grand confrontation and no final dramatic showdown. The legal machinery we had put in place simply engaged its gears and moved forward with the cold efficiency of a freight train. The foreclosure notices transformed from threats on paper into undeniable reality. When the county sheriff arrived at their sprawling country club estate to execute the eviction order, my mother refused to open the massive mahogany doors. She locked herself inside the master bedroom, clutching her designer handbags and sobbing, while the officers calmly brought in a locksmith. My father stood on the meticulously manicured front lawn, watching in absolute stunned silence, as the moving company hired by the bank began carrying out their custom furniture piece by piece. For decades, they had built their entire identity on the illusion of wealth. They had sacrificed their own daughter and abandoned their dying father just to maintain the appearance of belonging to an elite social circle. But the moment the truth about their financial crimes became public record, that elite circle slammed its doors shut. The country club immediately revoked their membership, citing a moral turpitude clause in the bylaws. When my mother tried to attend the annual spring charity luncheon, hoping to pretend everything was just a temporary misunderstanding, she was politely but firmly turned away by security at the entrance. The wealthy friends they had desperately tried to impress suddenly developed a collective case of amnesia. Phone calls went to voicemail. Invitations dried up. When my parents were forced to move into a cramped, low-income apartment complex on the industrial side of town, nobody came to help them unpack. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that their new apartment has thin walls, flickering fluorescent lights in the hallway, and a lingering smell of damp carpets. It is a world away from the vaulted ceilings and champagne toasts they traded my grandfather for. Greg faced a reckoning that was entirely his own making. The dossier I had provided to his boss was merely the spark that ignited a massive powder keg. Once the state licensing board opened an investigation into his business practices, they uncovered a labyrinth of hidden debts, fraudulent property appraisals, and misappropriated funds. The civil lawsuits rained down on him in a torrential downpour. Creditors froze his bank accounts. His firm completely disavowed him, leaving him to drown under the weight of mounting legal fees. He was stripped of his commercial real estate license and faced the very real possibility of criminal charges. Ashley, the sister who had always been the golden child, the one who laughed at my modest salary and mocked me as a pathetic hourly worker, discovered that her perfect marriage was nothing more than a house of cards. When the luxury cars were repossessed and the credit cards were declined, she did not stand by her husband. She packed her remaining expensive clothes into a cheap rental car and filed for divorce. The empire they had tried to build by stepping on my neck had crumbled into dust, leaving them with absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, I was standing on the precipice of a completely different life. The commercial real estate developers descended on me almost immediately after the will was executed. They flooded my office with incredibly lucrative offers, waving checks for millions of dollars to bulldoze my grandfather's land and build a massive retail shopping center. It would have been the easy choice. I could have taken the money, invested it, and lived a quiet, comfortable life completely removed from the chaos of my past. But every time I looked at those glossy architectural renderings of strip malls and parking lots, I felt a deep twist in my gut. That land belonged to Grandpa Henry. He had worked his entire life to secure it. Selling it to the highest bidder felt like a betrayal of the man who had trusted me with his legacy. I called attorney Thomas Davis and asked him to meet me at the property. We stood together on the vast empty lot, feeling the cool morning breeze sweep through the tall grass. I told him I did not want a retail center. I wanted to build something that meant something. I remembered the endless, exhausting nights I spent caring for Grandpa Henry alone. I remembered the sheer terror of trying to manage his medications, his comfort and his dignity without any support system. No elderly person should ever have to face the end of their life feeling abandoned, and no caregiver should ever have to shoulder that burden in total isolation. With Thomas guiding me through the complex legal and financial frameworks, we established a non-profit foundation. We hired architects not to design a shopping mall, but to design a sanctuary. We called it Henry's Haven. It was going to be a state-of-the-art senior care and community facility. We planned for bright, airy rooms with massive windows that let in the natural light. We designed indoor gardens where residents could sit and read, therapeutic recreation centers, and a dedicated wing for caregiver support, offering respite and resources for families who were struggling to care for their loved ones. We funded the entire project using the commercial land as our foundation and the recovered medical trust fund as our initial operating capital. The day we broke ground on the facility was the same day I walked into the hospital and handed my supervisor my official resignation letter. I packed my small desk into a single cardboard box, turned in my employee badge, and walked out of the billing department for the last time. For years, I had sat under those buzzing fluorescent lights arguing with insurance companies over billing codes, feeling my soul slowly drain away, while I worried about how I was going to afford my grandfather's care. Stepping out through the sliding glass doors of the hospital and feeling the warm sun on my face was a revelation. I was no longer Clara Mitchell, the invisible medical billing specialist. I was the executive director of the Henry's Haven Foundation, and I had a purpose that filled me with boundless energy. Watching the facility rise from the ground over the next year was the most healing experience of my life. Every wooden beam that was framed, every pane of glass that was installed felt like a victory over the darkness of my past. We hired incredible, compassionate staff members who shared our vision of providing dignity and joy to the elderly. When we finally opened our doors, the community response was overwhelming. We filled our residential rooms within the first month, and our caregiver support groups became a lifeline for dozens of local families. walking down the wide, brightly lit corridors of Henry's Haven, hearing the sound of laughter from the recreation room, and seeing the residents thriving filled my heart with a profound, unshakable peace. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, I bought a massive bouquet of fresh, vibrant sunflowers. They were my grandfather's favorite. I drove to the cemetery, the same place where I had stood shivering in the torrential rain just a few years earlier. The contrast between that day and this one could not have been more striking. The sky above me was a brilliant cloudless blue. The air was warm and smelled of blooming jasmine and fresh-cut grass. The cemetery, which had once felt like a place of profound sorrow and isolation, now felt incredibly peaceful. I walked down the familiar path, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes until I reached his headstone. The engraved marble was warm to the touch. I knelt down and placed the bright yellow sunflowers against the grey stone, carefully arranging the stems. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the wind rustle through the large oak trees that lined the perimeter of the burial grounds. I did not feel any sadness. I did not feel any lingering anger toward the people who had abandoned us. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I touched the top of the headstone and whispered into the quiet afternoon air. I told him about the foundation. I told him about the gardens we had planted in his honor and the people whose lives were being changed every single day because of his final act of brilliant protective love. I thanked him. I thanked him not just for the financial resources, but for giving me the ultimate tool to finally stand up for myself. He had seen my worth when my own parents had treated me like a burden. He had handed me the key to my own cage and trusted me to find the courage to turn the lock. Standing up, brushing the grass from my knees, I looked out over the rolling green hills of the cemetery. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet, warm air. I had survived the storm. I had faced the absolute worst of my toxic family, and I had emerged stronger, more resilient, and completely whole. The invisible daughter was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her value and refused to ever shrink herself for anyone else again. Family is not defined by the blood that suffocates you. It is defined by the people who hold an umbrella over you when it is raining. Setting hard boundaries with toxic people is not cruel. It is basic survival. If this story gave you the strength to stand up for yourself, please hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to save your own life? Tell me your story in the comments. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next video.